Hello, curious minds, and welcome back to Moonlight Science, where curiosity floats between myth and evidence, and the quiet hum of history meets the thrum of cosmic mystery. Tonight, we step into shadows older than memory, a time when gods allegedly walked among mortals, when stone and starlight told the same story. The Anunnaki, those enigmatic beings etched into Sumerian tablets, have fascinated and confounded scholars for generations. But beneath the familiar legends lies a whisper. Rumors of a final king, the last of an otherworldly lineage, whose disappearance 13,000 years ago may have set the course for every civilization since. Was he real? A mythic echo of human ambition? Or evidence of something humanity was never meant to remember? The deeper we dig, the stranger the clues become. Ancient cities aligned to stars, forbidden inscriptions swallowed by sand, and scientific anomalies buried under polite silence. So take a deep breath, step softly past the veil of accepted history, and follow me into one of the oldest cover-ups on Earth. In a museum basement in southern Iraq, under humming fluorescent lights and the careful breath of gloved curators, lies a collection of baked clay fragments no bigger than a hand. They are cracked, weathered, and dull to anyone who glances at them for the first time. Just more shards pulled from ancient soil, yet pressed into their brittle surfaces are wedge-shaped marks that whisper of a time when stories were carved, not told. These are the Sumerian tablets, humanity's earliest surviving words, written at a time when writing itself was a newborn invention. And within those strange symbols begins the story of a mystery so deep it bends the edges of history itself. When the first of these tablets was unearthed in the late 19th century, archaeologists celebrated them as miracles of literacy. Lists, ledgers, hymns to crop gods, and chronicles of long-forgotten kings. The ancients, it seemed, were as practical as they were poetic, counting sheep one line, praising the stars the next. But among the dusty crates catalogued under inventory codes and museum jargon, a subset of symbols stood apart. These tablets spoke of visitors who descended from the shining heavens, bringing gifts of law, of language, and of measurement. The scribes called them the Anunnaki, the lords of the sky. The words were there in coppery impressions a millennia old, and yet to modern scholars they made no sense. Sumer, around 4000 BCE, was supposed to be mankind's first descent out of prehistory. Huts giving way to cities, barter to trade, myth to mathematics. But how then did farmers with reed houses and stone tools describe with uncanny accuracy the motions of Jupiter, the tilt of Earth's axis, and the shifting pattern of equinoxes? On one tablet, still sharp after 6,000 years, a cluster of dots arranged in spirals marks planets invisible without telescopes. Another records the exact length of the year to within 2 decimal places of modern calculation. Oxford astronomers examining high-resolution scans confirmed that the data matched orbital movements only measurable with sophisticated equipment. How did they know? No one agreed, and most preferred not to ask. To the official record, the answer was metaphor. Heaven was inspiration, descent was revelation, and gods were merely human imagination stepping through the fog of ignorance. Yet even the most cautious philologists noticed something troubling. The same sequence of symbols that describe the creation of kingship, handed from sky to earth, appear unchanged across the multiple city-states that often warred with one another. It was as if every Sumerian settlement had received the same script from a single source, a lesson plan from heaven. And then, impossibly subtly, came the silence. buried within what scholars call the Sumerian king list, a carved chronology of rulers stretching back before the flood. There is a gap between the reigns of two semi-mythic monarchs. Every other inscription flows gracefully, line by line, naming each sovereign, their cities, and their years. But in one portion, the surface is ground smooth, the text erased as deliberately as if the stone cutter wished to remove the memory of a person from the earth itself. Later scribes filled that blank space with repairs and copies, yet echoes of the deletion remain. Under angled light, faint lines form the outline of characters, marks that some researchers claim yield a name. Ankaru. Others insist it is illusion. The clay, they say, simply cracked. Yet the pattern reemerges on seals and artifacts from hundreds of miles away, suggesting whatever was erased in one city survived in the whispers of another. The anomaly left historians in a bind. Official publications cited political revision, a mundane explanation that the missing name belonged to a disgraced ruler, forgotten after an ugly war or a failed harvest. But the private correspondences between field archaeologists tell a different story. In one letter never intended for print, a researcher writes of a strangeness in these tablets, a sense they were written not to be read, but to be rediscovered. The implication hangs in the air. Perhaps these aren't purely historical records, but a message encoded by people who thought we would one day dig it up. If that sounds fanciful, consider what came next. In a sealed archive labeled simply miscellaneous, carbon-dated fragments were found describing a cataclysm when the law from the stars was withdrawn. After that, no record of the Anunnaki appears again in official inscriptions. The very word was banned from temple recitations for reasons never explained. A royal decree survives, forbidding scribes from engraving divine names deemed treacherous to kingship. Every trace of one particular figure, possibly the final ruler linked to these sky beings, was chiseled away, even from myths. Who had the power to erase a god-king from history? In a world where belief was law, defiling a divine record was dangerous. Yet someone, or something, decided that this being's name must vanish. Each missing line, each smooth patch of tablet, is an act of censorship stretching across millennia. Even now, modern researchers handle these relics with quiet awe. Under their magnifying lamps, cuneiform wedges glow like tiny constellations. Every line carved by an ancient hand hints that civilization as we know it began not with ignorance, slowly brightening into knowledge, but with knowledge abruptly buried under ignorance. The tablets shouldn't exist. Their precision defies their age. Their silence about a single erased king roars louder with every translation. And so the question looms, casting its long shadow across all that follows. Was this forgotten monarch merely human, excised for earthly politics? Or was he the last trace of a presence the world was never meant to remember? Whatever truth lies pressed into that clay, the storm of history has only half erased it, leaving us to read between the cracks and wonder who or what descended to teach humanity how to write its first sentences, only to demand that one name be struck out forever. The erasure of the final king's name left a silence that could almost be felt, like the echo of a bell long after its sound has vanished. But even if that figure was struck from memory, whatever force had shaped his world left fingerprints everywhere in the centuries that followed. The rise of Sumer was not a gentle unfolding like spring following winter. It was an explosion, an improbable leap that defies the slow arithmetic of history. Within the narrow valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, humanity seemed to awaken overnight, standing suddenly upright in the dawn of civilization, as if nudged from sleep by invisible hands. Archaeologists chart this leap in data points. Villages coalescing into cities in less than 5 generations, irrigation systems appearing with mathematical precision, brick ziggurats rising where mud huts stood only decades before. The rhythm of progress, which elsewhere in prehistory crawled over millennia, here sprinted like a fever dream. Textiles, metallurgy, astronomy, writing, taxation, all the complicated marvels that usually take ages to evolve, arrived in a synchronized chorus, each invention dependent on the next, as though the composers of progress already knew the tune. Scholars have long debated why this region became the cradle of everything humans would later call civilization. Geography offers one answer: fertile floodplains, rivers that shift yet never fail, and a climate coaxing steady harvests. But there's a disquieting precision to the timing, as though every factor conspired, almost intelligently, to produce an outcome. It was as if someone, or something, had written a blueprint and then, at a chosen moment, turned the first page. The ancient inhabitants themselves never claimed credit. Their own stories insist the knowledge was given. In temple hymns, they describe luminous beings walking the riverbanks. Rays in the form of men, who measured the heavens before they measured the fields, who planted not only seeds in soil, but symbols in the human mind. They came, the chants say, from the mouth of the sky, bringing tools of balance and number. In clay and in legend, the scene repeats: a descent, an instruction, a covenant. Yet none of these accounts dwell on the gods' vanity or wrath. Their central act was teaching. Modern anthropology, allergic to miracles, attributes that teaching to the inventiveness of desperate farmers. But beneath that narrative runs another thread, genetic. Over the last decades, DNA extracted from ancient Mesopotamian skeletons revealed a curious discontinuity. Before 5000 BCE, the genetic record shows a fairly uniform population descended from early Near Eastern foragers. Then, abruptly, markers appear that cannot be traced to any neighboring group. They do not resemble Anatolian farmers or steppe herders or South Asian migrants. They appear out of nowhere, as if a new lineage had been folded into humanity overnight. The traits are minor but real. Altered cranial volume ratios, different dental enamel proteins, metabolic oddities suggesting adaptation to high radiation or perhaps high altitude. None of those features align with known human migrations. Scientists catalog the data carefully, avoiding sensational conclusions. But among the more candid discussions, one can sense unease. Hybridization, they call it, though they cannot find both parents in the fossil record. Perhaps these were symbolic hybrids, cultures blending, ideas mixing. But the numbers resist easy metaphor. The genetic timeline begins exactly when the first true cities rise and writing appears. Evolution does not move that fast on its own. Something, or someone, accelerated it. Within temples, ancient carvings freeze that miracle in stone. One tablet shows a human figure kneeling before a taller being haloed in rays, receiving a small object shaped like a cone or seed. The inscription beneath calls it essence of kingship, gifted from heaven. To the faithful, it meant divine blessing. To modern researchers, the object resembles a stylized pine cone or a capsule. Every civilization inherits symbols it can't decode. Perhaps this was one of them. As the centuries passed, the people of Sumer grew to describe their benefactors less as gods and more as ancestors. They built monumental stairways called ziggurats, reaching upward like frozen prayers. At the summit, priests waited for the return of those bright teachers. Rituals reenacted the descent, smoke rising as if to draw light back down to earth. When the shining ones walked among clay, a surviving tablet reads, They made men in their likeness and breathed into them the light of reason. Whether poetry or confession, the line blurs between religion and remembrance. Historians searching for mundane explanations call it cultural compression, a convergence of trade, language, and surplus yielding an illusion of sudden advancement. Yet elsewhere, the same resources existed and yielded only tribes, not temples. Sumer was different. It behaved less like a society discovering itself and more like one rebooting after amnesia, reactivating buried programs left by unseen engineers. Perhaps those luminous beings were metaphors for human brilliance finally flickering to life. Or perhaps they were real, and their footprints still linger beneath the silt of forgotten riverbanks. The clay vessels, the star-calibrated city grids, the temples aligned to solstices, all markers of a mind that thought beyond survival. Something had touched humanity then, something that turned observation into calculation, belief into geometry. When heaven touched dirt, the world changed course. Whether that touch came from gods, mentors, or exiles from some lost age of science, its imprint endures. Within the clay that bore our first words hide traces of a teacher's hand guiding the stylus. And though the celestial visitors vanished as quickly as they came, their students carried on, armed with knowledge they scarcely understood, but could never forget. Civilization was not born. It was remembered. And in that remembrance lay the first hint that humanity's story was far older and far stranger than even its creators dared to record. When the first artisans of Sumer pressed styluses into wet clay, they did more than record words. They preserved faces. Across palace walls and temple reliefs, they carved their gods not as swirling abstractions of light, but as beings astonishingly tangible. Tall figures stood posed in profile, shoulders squared beneath layered garments that fit not like robes, but like protective armor. In some reliefs, coils ran from chest to waist. Small circular shapes dotted their cuffs. A raised ridge encircled their faces like a sealed collar. At first glance, this could be ornamentation, the stylized excess of holy iconography. But high-resolution imaging of these carvings, newly completed during restorations at the British Museum, revealed details no sculptor should have imagined 4,000 years before pressure suits existed. Fine rivets along seams, jointed plates, even what appear to be control dials engraved on wristbands. The discovery jolted the scholarly world for a moment before it quietly fell back into obscurity. Those who studied Near Eastern art insisted the features were symbolic. The tubes were serpents of divinity, and the collars represented halos of authority. Others, less bound by orthodoxy, noted that similar motifs appeared far beyond Mesopotamia. Akkadian stelae, Babylonian reliefs, and even later Assyrian carvings repeated the same strange uniform: layered garments with structured seams, helmets with circular faceplates, and rectangular devices strapped to forearms. The figures striding through those scenes did not hover ethereally. They looked functional, purposeful, engineered. Some called the resemblance pareidolia, the human mind's tendency to force patterns from chaos. A few dismissed the tubes as decorative beards and the control panels as bracelets. But statistical analysis told another story. The repetition was too precise, replicated by generations of artists across centuries who would never have met. There were rules to these depictions: the correct number of coils, the placement of circular emblems, the meticulous scaling between helmet and torso. Such discipline suggested not creativity, but observation. Artists tend to stylize what they know. They only copy what they revere. The high priests wrote that these garments allowed the gods to walk between wind and water. That poetic phrase, long read as mythic flourish, takes a stranger tone when combined with images of masked beings sealed within fitted shells. One tablet from Nippur even illustrates a being extending its arm, palm out, inside a ray-like cone that scholars labeled blessing energy. Yet when computer-modeled using physics simulations, the pattern matches the dispersal cone of fluid propulsion, a vent of vapor or compressed gas. Still, institutional caution ruled the debate. The official publications avoided language that could invite ridicule, substituting ritual vestments or ceremonial regalia. But within museum back rooms, curators whispered, "There's something technical about them," one conservator admitted during a private interview. "You look long enough, and it feels less like fantasy and more like a schematic drawn in devotion." Those whispers gained weight when restorers cleaned a basalt fragment found near Kish. Hidden under layers of desert salt were traces of paint, silver around the torsos of divine figures, dull copper around their arms, a hue that once glittered like metal. To the ancients, these colors might have signified godhood. Chemically, they mirrored the alloys used in early bronze work. Someone intentionally chose metallic pigments to represent beings described as shining like the sun. Whether divine metaphor or literal description, brightness was their nature. Even stranger was the discovery of miniature clay models unearthed near temple foundations. Tiny figurines, each with a smooth dome upon the head and depressions for eyes covered by a single ridge. Around the body coiled intricate lines scored with stylus tips, imitating cables. These objects were offerings, tokens meant to honor, perhaps emulate, the larger figures. People who had never seen metal flight suits still sculpted them with astonishing fidelity. The devotion suggests memory rather than imagination, a longing to reproduce teachers who had once stood among them. Art historians offer psychological explanations. Humanity projects progress backward, painting its gods in its own highest image. And yet these early depictions reverse that logic, primitive humans styling their creators with technology far beyond their comprehension. The resemblance to breathing gear or environmental suits may be coincidence. But if coincidences keep reappearing, they start to qualify as evidence. In the dim conservation labs where these artifacts now rest, their silent postures seem almost self-aware. Under raking light, the grooves of their engravings gleam metallically, details sharpened by time instead of dulled. Their faces, calm, enclosed, unseen, stare out from the dawn of civilization as if caught mid-instruction. Perhaps they were gods only in translation, engineers rendered divine by the awe of those who watched them descend. Generations later, as myths evolved, those images softened into halos, wings, and robes of light. The machinery was forgotten, replaced by metaphor, yet the oldest artistry remains stubbornly literal. Each line carved into clay insists that the first teachers of humanity were not content to rule from the heavens. They walked the earth, masked against its air, shaping mud into monuments before vanishing once more into sky. Whether these were holy visions or visitors in armor, we may never know. What endures is the sense that early humanity looked upward not merely in faith, but in recognition, that somewhere above the storm clouds lingered beings whose return they awaited, leaving behind only the ghost of technology immortalized in stone. For centuries after the luminous beings vanished from river valley cities, the scribes of Sumer continued to carve their names into clay. Not the names of the gods themselves now, but the names of those they left behind. Kings who measured the floodwaters, set grain taxes, built ziggurats rising like stairways to memory. And among these lists, preserved by improbable luck within temple libraries, there exists a tablet so strange that it blurs forever the line between history and fable. It is small, warped by heat and pitted by time, but when sunlight strikes its surface, the wedge marks shimmer like starlight. It is called by scholars the King List of Heaven's Descent. Unlike ordinary administrative records, it begins not with the founding of a city, but with the creation of sovereignty itself. It claims that kingship was first delivered from the sky, as if authority were a meteorite landing amid clay huts. After that gift came a succession of rulers whose reigns stretch into absurdity. 36,000 years for Alulim of Eridu, 28,000 for his successor, and so on through what the tablet calls antediluvium, before the flood. To Orthodox historians, this is myth, bookkeeping spun into mythology. But among the cautious comments scribbled in margins of excavation reports, one uneasy observation recurs. The layer in which the tablet was found sits below. City ash dated to nearly 3000 BCE, embedded in strata extending deeper still. The accompanying shards, pottery, calcined reed impressions, bear carbon dates drifting far older than civilization should be. When questioned, the lead excavation team suggested the clay itself could have been recycled, or that contamination skewed the readings. But private correspondence between two field experts reveals their discomfort. If contamination, one wrote, then it is universal. Every sample from that depth reads the same impossible age. What nobody dared to print was the alternate possibility that the text was what it claimed. A record copied from an older source already ancient when Sumer was young. The numbers themselves seemed nonsense, until a group of astronomers, curious outsiders in the usually cautious halls of archaeology, plotted them on a timeline of known cosmic events. A pattern emerged. Each immense reign corresponded closely to a measurable interval between great celestial disturbances, periodic comet appearances, magnetic excursions, even subtle wobbles in Earth's axis that recur roughly every 26,000 years. Where the text spoke of the rule of Andauk for 28,000 years, planetary models showed a matching precessional cycle when the constellation of Leo first rose at dawn during the equinox. These coincidences multiplied. The 10 kings before the flood, long dismissed as symbols of divine hierarchy, aligned almost perfectly with 10 great astronomical epochs visible in orbital statistics. If their years were not solar, but perhaps counted in lunar months or coded cycles of the heavens, then the impossible lifespans compress neatly into comprehensible spans. 7 decades, 9 decades. A sequence that begins to sound human again, but the underlying message remains confronting. The scribes tracked reigns through the rhythm of the cosmos, gauging authority by the sky's precision rather than by harvests or wars. Kingship itself was astronomical, its legitimacy confirmed when particular stars rose or when a comet's tail flared white across the night. To rule was to mirror heaven's timetable. Staring at the tablet's scratchy columns, one can almost picture the priests standing upon platform roofs, eyes lifted to the dark. Armillary spheres of bronze creaked as they rotated. They were not merely stargazers. They were historians taking notes on eternity. By their reckoning, time was less a flowing river than a wheel turning endlessly through known patterns. Humanity, they believed, did not advance in a straight line, but circled back repeatedly to beginnings. The so-called Sky Kings, with their extravagant ages, may represent these returns. Ages of guidance when celestial teachers once more descended to align mankind with the great year of the cosmos. Modern astronomers often smile at such romantic speculation. Yet even they admit how faintly our planet responds to cosmic cycles. Slight magnetic flips, temperature shifts, mysterious pulses of radiation washing through from deep space every few millennia. To ancients who lived close to the sky, such upheavals must have appeared as the arrival and departure of gods. Perhaps the Sky Kings were not individuals at all, but eras, civilizations rising and falling in synchrony with heavenly mechanics. Perhaps what Sumer recorded as divine dynasties were memories of repeating worlds, the same stage rebuilt under each turning of the cosmic clock. When the last lines of the tablet enumerate the flood that swept away the seed of kingship, the pattern stops. Heaven withdrew. The wheel paused. All subsequent reigns become mortal, paced in human years rather than cosmic ones. It is easy to read this as mythic poetry, yet a subtler reading lingers. That the link between earth and sky, once literal, was severed. Those who measured their age by the stars were gone, leaving their calendar half broken in baked clay. The rest of human history has been an attempt to start that clock again, never realizing that its missing gears lay buried beneath our feet, ticked once by kings who ruled for as long as the heavens allowed. And then, perhaps mercifully, fell silent. Among the many tablets uncovered from the ruins of ancient cities, none bewilders historians more than those inscribed with lists of rulers. The meticulous genealogies of kingship etched in cuneiform. Each line tells of a monarch's rise, his deeds, the years of his reign, and finally, the quiet phrase announcing his end before another takes the throne. The pattern repeats like heartbeat. Order, continuity, legitimacy, except once. In one version of the king list, recovered from a temple cache near Larsa, the pattern ruptures, replaced by silence and scars. Where another name should appear, the surface is ground smooth, its characters erased as though scraped by a craftsman, intent not simply on correction, but obliteration. Later, scribes rewrote new lines over the damaged section. Yet under the right light, one can still trace the ghost of earlier marks. The name that once stood there is uncertain, but fragments whisper a sound. Ankaru. When philologists first examined the erasure, they treated it as clerical error. Perhaps, they argued, two copies of the list were merged clumsily, and one ruler accidentally struck twice. But the evidence of deliberate destruction, chisels driven deep until the clay warped, betrays intent more personal than mistake. The damage is violent, nearly ritualistic, and the timing curious. Immediately after this missing reign, the style of law codes across Sumer changes abruptly. Regulations that once praised the divine balance now emphasize punishment and obedience. It is as if society itself pivoted from collaboration to control overnight. Whatever occurred during the years hidden beneath that scraped surface reverberated far beyond one man's rule. The name survived in the high, unlikeliest of places. Small cylinder seals found buried under a collapsed warehouse bore half-preserved inscriptions. On one seal, a fragment reads, "To the Lord Ankaru, Lightbringer," followed by symbols suggesting both mourning and rebellion. Another from the site of Kish replaces the syllable Karu with Kara. Yet the imagery is identical. A winged figure holding an orb, encircled by 12 stars. Historians, faced with these echoes, soon recognized the recurring motif stretched across cultures like a stubborn echo. In early Anatolian myths appears Ankar, the sky shepherd. Later, Egyptian hymns mention Ancheru, a fallen visitor who brought fire and vanished. Even in faraway Indus script inscriptions, half-decoded symbols translate roughly as the Lord who ascended twice. Two vanishings, then. The first erasure took him from the physical world, the second from memory. In history's double burial, he became the king who vanished twice. Yet traces of his influence remain like fingerprints pressed into wet clay long ago. Artifacts attributed to his supposed era show a break with tradition, temples oriented toward new star alignments, statistical leaps in metallurgy, and strange votive figurines depicting elongated crowns never seen before or after. Those crowns, recently scanned by photogrammetry, reveal patterns resembling circuitry, a spiraling lattice of geometric precision carved by artisans who had no calculus to guide them. What calamity demanded his annihilation? Theories proliferate, each half-mad yet compelling. Some suggest that he attempted to bridge human and divine realms literally, opening forbidden communication between earth and heaven. Others suspect revolt, a failure that humiliated priestly authorities who controlled divine law. A few researchers, voices at the farthest fringe, propose something cosmic, that under his rule, a celestial event darkened the skies, misinterpreted as divine wrath, forcing priests to blame the king who communed too boldly with the stars. In their panic, they chiseled him out to break the curse, as though erasure might repair heaven itself. Ancient correspondence fragments support the sense of crisis. A letter from a high priest of Nippur to an unnamed ruler pleads that the balance of fire and water is broken. The eye of Anu trembles. Such language implies astronomical disturbance, a comet perhaps, or the dimming of a star. Soon afterward, temple records cease. Trade accounts end mid-line. Only years later, governance resumes with new vocabulary, speaking now of reconstruction and atonement. The gap in writing is like the pause between thunder and its echo. In later centuries, poets revived that lost name as legend. In Akkadian schools of magic, initiates whispered of Ankara, the teacher punished for sharing heaven's secrets. Some versions cast him as hero, others as traitor. But all agree on one image, a figure striding into brightness, body dissolving, into light rather than blood. Ascending, as tablets phrase it, once in glory and again in exile. The myth may veil an older truth, that a person, or something worshipped as a person, vanished before witnesses and left society reeling. When scholars translate those erasures into digital reliefs, the gaps appear almost deliberate invitations. Lines flow up to the void and stop abruptly. Stylus marks fading as if waiting to reconnect. The artists who cut out his name did not simply destroy, they curated amnesia. And yet, amnesia never lasts. Each rediscovered fragment, each repeating echo of that banned syllable across continents, suggests that memory itself resists censorship. The king who vanished twice might yet return a third time, if only through the persistence of questions refusing to die. When the name of the vanished king faded from every record, the earth itself began to tell the story that scribes no longer dared to carve. Beneath layers of sand and silt, the land preserved a memory that defied written censorship. A memory of drowning. Every culture born along the rivers of Mesopotamia spoke of it, each in its own rhythm and tongue. Sumer called it the flood of cleansing. Akkad called it the waters of regret. And later, Hebrew texts distilled it into a single word heavy with grief, deluge. On the surface, these myths sound like moral parables. Mankind punished for arrogance, divine wrath expressed through rain. But the soil holds a colder narrative carved in mineral and ash. When geologists sliced cores from the basin plains, expecting ordinary patterns of fertile alluvium, they encountered something far stranger. Two distinct bands of disaster, stacked like wounds upon one another, each marking a cataclysm that had remade the world. The lower layer showed signs of intense combustion, charred soil mixed with vitrified rock where nothing should have burned. Above it lay a thicker band of fine gray silt deposited by floods moving with unimaginable violence. These layers date to roughly 11,000 BCE, centuries before the rise of the first known city. Civilization, it seems, was not born gently. It was a survival strategy. Magnetic sediments reveal what rainfall alone could not accomplish. Entire coastlines shifted abruptly. Oceanographers studying isotopes in ancient shells traced a global pulse of freshwater pouring into the seas, the result not of ordinary storms, but of titanic glacial melt. As the Ice Age collapsed, vast walls of frozen water near the Arctic fractured, releasing volumes heavy enough to tilt the planet's rotation by fractions of a degree. Rivers reversed, climates spasmed, and every culture that would later call itself human inherited the trauma as myth. To those who survived, the sky must have looked broken. To their descendants, it remained a wound disguised as theology. And yet, none of these geological facts explain the details whispered in the older texts. There, the flood is not simply accident. It is decree. Gods convene, arguments blaze, and one voice demands silence by water. This decision arrives precisely where the erased king's name should stand on the tablets. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps confession in disguise. The narrative always mentions one chosen survivor, warned before the catastrophe, commanded to build an ark, a vessel, an archive. The pattern suggests more than divine whim. It reads like protocol, procedure. A controlled burn of civilization, followed by selective preservation. Many archaeologists resist giving the story intention. Catastrophe requires no author, only physics and bad luck. Still, the precision of timing haunts the data. The two overlapping disasters, the fiery layer below, the flood above, occurred within a single century, an improbably narrow window on a geological timescale. Some force synchronized fire with water, as though following an instruction manual written in lightning. If that synchronization was natural, it was the most improbable accident in planetary memory. If not natural, then orchestrated. In temple traditions written millennia later, priests claimed that the gods loosed the rivers to hide the sin of their children. Perhaps that sin was knowledge, forbidden or premature. Legends of the erased monarch describe him possessing the ability to summon the light of heaven during nights of instability. If such power implied harnessing energies from the atmosphere or beneath the earth, its failure could have triggered chaos. Cleaning the slate might have been both punishment and necessity, a reset to prevent recurrence. The gods withdraw, but fragments of their order survive in those chosen few who ride the waters. The earliest genealogies after the flood claim descent from these rescued guardians, implying continuity by design rather than chance. Beneath the southern deserts of Iraq, ground-penetrating radar has detected outlines of stone foundations buried under meters of silt, older than any known temple. They rest precisely between the two disaster layers, a drowned city sealed in time. Samples taken from its blackened clay show traces of carbonized reed and melted quartz, signatures of heat surpassing 1,000 degrees Celsius, followed by instantaneous submersion. Nothing in nature neatly combines fire and flood, destruction and preservation at once, unless intention intervenes. Perhaps what the ancients called divine judgment was crisis control from a civilization far beyond the memory of its own survivors. The myths remember fury, the rocks recall timing. Between them drifts a possibility. Someone pressed a planetary reset, erased the traces of a reign that overreached, and left the world to dry before life began again. And when new peoples later built their ziggurats upon that sacred mud, they were standing not on the dawn of history, but on the cinders of one that had been deliberately drowned. Whether by nature or design, the flood was no simple rain. It was the silence that follows a decision too great to explain, and the beginning of humanity's second chance. When the waters finally receded, the planet drew its first unsteady breath. A miracle, or perhaps a mystery, unfolded. Out of the mud, humanity did not crawl feebly, building huts of reeds like lost children. It rose already remembering how to shape stone, how to measure the heavens, how to call itself royal. The first cities that appeared after the flood were not primitive encampments, but fully conceived civilizations, as if blueprints had been waiting beneath the waters all along. Across the new valleys of the Tigris and Nile, monumental architecture emerged in synchrony, carried by societies that spoke different tongues, yet built as if they shared a single architect. Archaeologists describe a cultural explosion that should have taken millennia compressing into mere centuries. In Sumer, temples aligned again to lost stars as though guided by memory. In Egypt, the first dynasties seemed to appear overnight, claiming descent from beings who stepped from the boat of heaven. In India's earliest hymns, sages spoke of teachers who had crossed the sea of fire long before there was a written word to record them. Everywhere the pattern repeats. Civilization reborn not from ignorance, but from recollection, as if a select few had carried within their minds and blood the instructions for rebuilding. The kings who claimed descent from those survivors carried particular titles: children of the sun, sons of the serpent, masters of the seed. Their genealogies stretch impossibly far back, each line tracing ancestry not merely to mythical gods, but to ancestors who came from beyond the storm. To the faithful, this meant divine favor. To those who read between the lines, it hints at something stranger, a preserved lineage shielding the remnants of whatever advanced people had thrived before the world washed clean. Even the bodies of the early rulers seem to whisper of difference. In royal tombs dated to the first dynasties, geneticists have begun extracting mitochondrial DNA, fragments that pass unbroken from mother to child. Among most populations, these sequences fall neatly into known branches of the human tree. Yet within a scattering of elite burials, an anomaly appears. Certain markers, rare to the point of vanishing, show substitutions unseen in neighboring peoples, but quietly persisting today among a few highland tribes in remote mountain regions. Those tribes, curiously, keep oral traditions claiming they are keepers of the fire of the sky people. At first, the data seemed flawed, contamination from modern handlers or statistical coincidence. But repetition across multiple sites has forced the cautious acknowledgement that an outlying genetic signature survived from the earliest historical strata. The lineage is matrilineal, as though a small number of women, perhaps literal survivors of the deluge, founded dynasties by introducing a trace of something that was both human and unfamiliar. The mitochondrial variations themselves are benign, altering minor cellular processes. Yet their endurance through time suggests evolutionary advantage. Cells with these markers show higher tolerance to radiation and slower oxidative decay, attributes that might have proved vital in a post-catastrophe world of unstable climates and heightened cosmic exposure. Legends preserve this memory through stories of blood and inheritance. Egyptian coronation hymns speak of a sacred fluid, a that must be preserved unmixed. In Mesopotamia, Records of sacred marriages between kings and priestesses repeat the phrase, to renew the seed of Anu. Later, dynasties from the Indus Valley to the Andes describe their rulers as born twice, once in body, once in spirit. But the earliest layers of those myths emphasize a more literal rebirth, as if longevity and intellect were gifts encoded in flesh. They treated genetics as sacrament without ever naming it as such. Symbols carved above early royal tombs often display twin serpents entwined, or spirals split into double paths. These images later evolve into emblems of fertility or medicine, but their geometry eerily mirrors the structure of the DNA helix. Coincidence, say the modern curators. Unlikely, whispers the mind that recognizes repetition. Perhaps those ancient artists were not guessing at life's shape. They were remembering it, fragment of knowledge passed down from ancestors who once understood it completely. What remains today of those bloodlines is faint, diluted by centuries of intermingling. Yet every human carries a residue of their inheritance. Scattered within our chromosomes lie stretches of junk DNA, regions not clearly linked to any organic function. Some of those stretches matched neither animal nor known hominid precursors. For now, science calls the mystery meaningless sequence, but the ancients might have named it differently. Memory made flesh. The flood scrubbed the world clean, but not entirely. Through genes and myths, through families who kept meticulous track of descent, something of the builders endured. Living time capsules transmitting architecture, astronomy, and law coded in both story and cell. They were the bridge between two worlds, the last witnesses of the old order and the founders of the new. Whatever mingling occurred before the waters rose had not been erased by them. It had only gone quiet, waiting. The next empires, their languages, scripts, and sciences, would rise from those few who still heard the echo of the forgotten bloodline humming softly within their veins. The deserts of Egypt seemed to have yielded all their secrets long ago. The pyramids had been mapped, measured, photographed from orbit, and dissected by theory until only wonder remained unquantified. And yet, in 2017, the sands shivered once more. A Japanese-French team using muon tomography, rays born from cosmic showers, scanned beneath the Great Pyramid to test a new imaging algorithm. The pictures they produced did more than redraw architecture. They unstitched history. Hidden below the bedrock, sealed beneath what was assumed to be natural limestone, appeared cavities too large and deliberate to be chance. The scans showed a system of geometric halls cut with mathematical precision, their alignment not with the pyramid's foundation, but with the mechanics of the sky. Angles mirrored the inclinations of planetary orbits. Curve ratios reproduced the synodic dance of Mercury and Earth. No tool marks visible, no debris. The chambers were older than everything above them, perhaps older than the desert itself. The team filed a cautious statement to the press, an anomaly consistent with human construction of unknown purpose, and then quietly went silent. Months later, fragments of the full data leaked through academic circles. Hidden among spectrographic graphs was a pattern of carvings found by remote probes lowered through drilled pinholes. The reliefs depicted a tall figure crowned by a ring of rays, stepping from something like a boat within a crescent. Alongside were cartouches, written in an archaic dialect that predated classical Egyptian. The partial translation read, Anka-Ru, he who received the breath of the sky and gave form to seed. The pronunciation was identical to the band name erased from Sumerian tablets thousands of years earlier. Official Egyptology, protective of its timelines, moved briskly. New permits were suspended, reports delayed. Public statements redirected attention to restoration projects elsewhere. A few technicians involved in the imaging spoke under anonymity. They described briefings from ministry officials instructing them to avoid interpretive associations with non-Egyptian civilizations. Yet within the private memos later leaked to journalists, a more intriguing line appeared. Prepare controlled dissemination to mitigate trans-regional mythology claims. Controlled dissemination, the polite phrase for quiet management of truths too world-altering to shout aloud. The notion that a figure from Mesopotamian myth could appear engraved beneath Giza places strains on every accepted chronology. Thousands of kilometers and centuries divide the two cultures in official history. Yet their cosmologies share DNA. Both envision creation as the act of ordering chaos by measurement. Both describe god-kings who rise from floods to establish law based on number and weight. Even the vocabulary of divine breath translates neatly between Sumerian and Old Egyptian dialects as the same pair of syllables for life fire. Philosophically, the parallel deepens. In Sumer, the heavens were a school for leadership. In Egypt, they became the afterlife's map. The pharaoh did not die. He ascended to rejoin those who descended first. The concept of resurrection that anchors Egyptian religion may well be the echo of that earlier disappearance. The vanishing of a king whose name meant the sky returns. The architects of Giza might have built their colossus as both tomb and diagram, encoding not mortality but a promise of recovery. Its subterranean blueprint, if the measurements are correct, replicates orbital ratios as though instructing future ages on how to navigate back home. Mathematicians analyzing the chamber geometry discovered recurring constants that should be impossible for Bronze Age builders to know. One angle mirrors the axial tilt of Mars, another describes the harmonic resonance of Earth's orbit and Venus's rotations. Embedded in stone is celestial algebra, equations disguised as corridors. Someone wanted the heavens translated into stone long before telescopes ever existed. The outer pyramid thus becomes skin, the deeper structure bone, an anatomical chart of the cosmos drawn for those who might one day notice. There is evidence that the earliest dynastic priests called the Great Pyramid Per-Ra-Ankeru, House of the Word of Ankeru. To later Egyptians, this became simply House of the Sun. But the older term is uncomfortably close to the forbidden name Ankaru. If those syllables connect the god-king of Sumer to the first pharaohs, then kingship itself was a resurrected covenant, an unbroken torch carried through the deluge, across deserts, reborn anew. Whether these associations point to shared myth, migration, or the survival of an actual epic before memory, no scholar publicly concedes. But in whispered conferences and off-record emails, the thought glimmers like gold leaf in darkness. Civilizations may differ in language, yet trace their origins to the same forgotten instructor. Beneath Giza, beneath the oldest stories carved into cuneiform, the blueprint remains. The patient geometry of a world designed not once, but twice. Each recreation looks upward, as if trying to remember where the builders went, or waiting for the day the last king of that first age returns to measure the skies again. High in the thin air of the Andes, where the horizon seems almost curved and the stars crowd so close that twilight never quite fades, there lies another fragment of the same forgotten story. The Andean Plateau, older than most mountains, children of both fire and water, holds within its basalt veins a memory that should not exist. Local shepherds knew of the ruins long before any scholar climbed those slopes. The places where stones hiss at night when the wind moves through their cracks, where carvings shimmer under moonlight as if the rock itself recalls the touch of stars. When the Spanish chroniclers heard legends from the Aymara and the Uros people of Lake Titicaca, they dismissed them as pagan poetry. The tales spoke of teachers from the sky, luminous and tall, arriving before the first sunrise of humankind, bringing words of power carved upon stones. Centuries later, rediscovery began with a landslide. In a ravine southeast of the lake, a farmer unearthed a slab covered in unfamiliar symbols. Archaeologists, expecting Incan glyphs, instead found rows of wedge-shaped impressions, astonishingly similar to Sumerian cuneiform. The pattern seemed impossible. The continents had known nothing of one another. Yet microscopic analysis showed the strokes were ancient, not forgeries. Their oxide layers consistent with weathering more than 10,000 years old. Subsequent excavations revealed an entire terrace of carved blocks buried under volcanic ash. A library written in stone. Each tablet bears repeating motifs, spiral suns, pairs of serpents twined around ladders of dots, and grids of characters no one can yet read. The language, if language it is, bridges the impossible gap between Mesopotamian syntax and Andean geometry. The locals, struck by the resemblance, still call the site Cascapacha, the landed heaven. From their myths, the beings who built it were not gods, but returners, survivors of a greater world drowned long before. They traveled west over a road of clouds, carrying fragments of their science, planting them at the world's high places in the hope that someday they would be found again. When geologists sampled the blocks, the data shocked even the skeptics. The rock was andesite, quarried, transported, and shaped with precision unrepeatable by Bronze Age technology. What's worse for orthodoxy, embedded organic fibers trapped in the joining mortar yielded radiocarbon dates circling 12,000 BCE. That era belonged to the end of the glacial cataclysms, the very window when the vanished king and his city of gods disappeared beneath floods in the old world. If the dates hold, someone in those chaotic centuries crossed oceans or survived them. Someone brought with them not just tools, but memory. Along the edges of the carvings, subtle wear marks imply repeated tracings by human hands across millennia. Pilgrims must have felt compelled to preserve the meaning of forms they no longer fully grasped, just as the Egyptians reinscribed the names of their gods long after forgetting their tongues. In a pattern barely visible to the naked eye, the stones align toward solstitial dawns, mapping the same celestial coordinates encoded in the sub-pyramidal chambers at Giza. The same obsession with the heaven arcs, the same trinity of stars mirrored on Earth. It is impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Separate continents, separate epochs, yet identical geometry. Those who study diffusionism argue that cultural parallels arise naturally. Stars are universal, human imaginations limited. But there is an undercurrent in this discovery that resists such rationalizations. The stones at Titicaca seem not inspired by stars, but informed by them, as if the builders knew their distances, oscillations, and harmonic ratios long before telescopes existed. Some physicists, reviewing the arrangement of drilled holes along certain slabs, remarked that the intervals match the frequencies of Earth's electromagnetic resonances. The sky teachers of myth may have understood the planet more intimately than its later inheritors did. Rumor claims one fragment, now hidden in a private collection, preserves a partial cartouche similar to the one beneath Giza. The translation offered by a linguist who saw it briefly consists of 3 symbols: the wing, the wave, and the throne. When arranged in reversed order, their phonetic value might be read as Anka-Ru. If authentic, the same erased name that once connected Mesopotamia and Egypt reaches across the Pacific, engraved into the spine of another continent. Perhaps, after the floods and the loss of the old empire, a remnant of its survivors scattered with their knowledge of measure and star. The Andean Plateau, safe above the tides, became a final archive, a refuge for their coded mathematics, their celestial maps, and the faint hope that another age of men would rediscover them. Standing among these stones now, the wind moving thin and metallic through the gaps, one feels not at a ruin, but in a library still waiting for its reader. The forgotten builders had written their testimony into mountain bones, a message that begins in Sumer, resonates beneath Giza, and ends here, half a world away, still whispering, "We were here, and the stars remember." In the high deserts where nothing grows but memory, shards of black glass still glitter under the dust, remnants of a catastrophe that remade the map of the sky. At first, geologists thought them ordinary volcanic remnants, but under microscopes, the fragments revealed strange order hidden in chaos. Magnetic grains inside the glass, all frozen in the same direction, as if the Earth's field had spasmed sideways in a single instant. Those signatures point to an event around 13,000 years ago, precisely when the world's myths say the heavens fell, and when the last age of gods dissolved into flood and flame. The data is stark. Samples taken from Siberia, from the northern Sahara, even from near Lake Titicaca, register identical magnetic reversal patterns, a planetary scream preserved in molten sand. Something immense jolted the planet's magnetic poles, throwing compass north toward where the sun never rises. Such shifts do not happen easily. They require some impulse, cosmic or internal, capable of shaking the planet's liquid iron core like a bell. Whatever occurred, it left behind not only geological scars, but human testimonies of terror that survived as myths of divine anger. Within the same strata of vitrified rock, archaeologists keep noticing carved fragments, tiny in the hand, but loaded with imagery that repeats across continents. Wings outspread, rivers curling through fire, suns splitting like seeds. At first, these symbols seemed purely decorative, until researchers realized the pattern matched actual sky phenomena that could only have been recorded by witnesses. Ancient astronomers must have seen auroras surging across equatorial skies, lightning crawling horizon to horizon, perhaps even meteor storms painting the heavens crimson. To minds who believe the sky itself divine, such spectacle would mean war among stars, the punishment of gods. The survivors left vivid accounts in their own languages. Sumerian laments tell of winds made of stone and light that turned to ash. Ancient American stelae recall a day the sun became two, then none. Diffuse as they are, every record agrees on emotion. Awe tangled with fear, shame laced through knowledge they were somehow responsible. In later centuries, that sorrow hardened into morality tales. Sin became metaphor for technology misused. Obedience replaced understanding. Yet hidden inside those scriptures of penance lies scientific memory, descriptions of magnetic chaos, radiation sickness, and nights lit brighter than noon. Was the disaster cosmic, a comet slicing too close, or was it the legacy of the Sky King's experiments? The question divides even the few who dare study it. Some theorize an asteroid impact destabilized the poles. Others whisper of energy drawn from the Earth itself, a force the ancients tried and failed to control. In either version, the symmetry is haunting. The catastrophe that ignited the fires also seems to have burned the coordinates of heaven into rock. When magnetic grains froze mid-flow, they stored orientation like perfect compasses, a geological photograph of the moment the world lost balance. Those patterns now guide modern scientists in tracing how continents shifted and climates convulsed, how the old empire quite literally cracked beneath their feet. Myth remembers it differently. It says the kingdom of light devoured itself, that its monarch, guardian of power beyond human grasp, attempted to raise a barrier between heaven and earth, a shield of flame to hold back whatever approached from the void, and that the mechanism's failure tore the sky instead. The image fits neatly with the evidence of vitrification spread worldwide, as if a transient second sun had ignited and vanished. Whether that weapon was divine invention or civilization overreaching, the outcome was the same. Fields reversed, storms global, the atmosphere ablaze. When the fires abated, mountains had moved. Water followed, filling voids left by molten rock. Those who crawled from the ruins saw a world tilted differently under unfamiliar stars. To them, the judgment of the gods had been swift, deliberate, absolute. They carried the memory into every story that followed, distilling lightning and magnetism into metaphors of sin and cleansing. Even now, those shards of glass hum faintly when struck by magnetometers, singing of that forgotten catastrophe. The planet still holds its breath between poles, wobbling gently as though remembering. And perhaps the myths endure because memory itself is magnetic, aligning our stories toward some lost truth, pulling every compass needle of curiosity back to the same invisible point where fire, sky, and human folly once met. The discovery came quietly, disguised amid the usual humdrum of satellite reconnaissance. Engineers charting mineral deposits across the Arabian Peninsula noticed that the dunes to the southwest of Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, were not behaving as dunes should. Their waves rolled in unnatural symmetry, each crest repeating the next by exact distance, forming a buried geometry visible only from orbit. When the images were enhanced, faint right angles and long corridors emerged, fossilized beneath centuries of shifting sand. It was not natural formation. It was architecture. Within weeks, a consortium of archaeologists, geophysicists, and quietly interested defense contractors descended upon the coordinates. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed what the satellites had seen. Rectangular foundations stretching for miles, laid with mathematical precision. The proportions mirrored those of early Mesopotamian temple complexes, 3 units broad, 5 long, aligned to cardinal points, but scaled up to almost impossible magnitude. The central avenue pointed not to any local horizon feature, but to the celestial coordinates of Orion as seen in 10,800 BCE, an alignment only an astronomer with future instruments could have calculated. The team called it Project Edamen, a nod to the Sumerian word for the temple that connected heaven and earth. For nearly a year, they worked under the veil of harmless administrative titles. The site yielded pottery shards, unlike those of any known culture, pieces of ceramic vitrified by intense heat. Then came the stone tablets, fragments of basalt inscribed with familiar but uncomfortable shapes. The wedge script of Sumer. How could writing older than writing appear here, 1,000 miles from its supposed birthplace? One line on the least damaged fragment carried a royal insignia, 3 concentric circles around a winged disk. Within the innermost ring, faint but legible under raking light, was the same name whispered from other ruins, and Ka-Ru. Leaks began the moment those symbols were photographed. Within days, state authorities declared the dig environmentally unstable and ordered evacuation. Heavy machinery appeared overnight, ostensibly to cap unsafe shafts, but effectively to seal them. When reporters requested comment, ministries invoked national security clauses relating to underground energy infrastructure. The drones vanished from public databases. Satellite feeds were scrubbed. On paper, nothing had ever been found there. But not everyone obeyed. A few field workers, unwilling to see their year of risk erased, smuggled out samples. Among the contraband were 2 slabs engraved with star maps, linking the constellation of Orion with an unfamiliar cluster near Leo. Precisely the same celestial relationship represented on Sumerian boundary stones that charted the descent of kings. Another object, smaller and far stranger, surfaced on the gray market. A copper seal mounted in obsidian, bearing a stylized throne flanked by twin serpents. Laboratory tests on its oxidation layers dated it near the end of the last ice age. The craftsmanship appeared machine-cut. Those fragments circulated briefly before vanishing into private collections. A single photograph remains. Egyptologists who viewed it under confidentiality agreements admitted the iconography was not inconsistent with early dynastic regalia, though the metal's purity exceeds pharaonic metallurgy. When independent geochemists compared isotopic signatures, they matched neither local ores nor Mesopotamian deposits. It is as though it came from no known mine on Earth, one analyst confessed off record. Rumors bloom in vacuums. Some claim the sealed city was not a settlement, but a vault, an ark meant to preserve the legacy of a dying civilization. Others whisper it was a facility designed to keep something buried. Espionage forums speak of heat anomalies still emanating from the region, a slow exhalation beneath sand too dark in satellite infrared. Officials attribute it to geothermal vents, though Arabia has none. What little documentation escaped suppression tells of walls of a black stone that swallows radar, corridors glazed into smoothness as if melted from within. One engineer likened them to glass tunnels, another to runways. If the coordinates correspond to the skies of 10,800 BCE, perhaps the city watched for something recurring, a celestial alignment feared or revered. And if the royal seal bearing the forbidden name truly belongs to its builder, then the king who vanished twice may not have vanished at all. He may have withdrawn here, into the desert, establishing a capital meant to survive memory itself. Now the dunes erase their traces again, conforming to the wind like obedient servants. Travelers who cross the empty quarter at night sometimes report a humming beneath their feet, a low magnetic vibration that makes compasses quiver. They call it the breathing ground. Perhaps it is only shifting sand and distant thunder. Or perhaps it is the last pulse of machinery entombed beneath 1,000 meters of silence, protecting a secret older than any nation. A city forbidden because it still belongs to a king the world pretends never existed. The silence that followed the disappearance of the Sky Kings was not absence, but choreography. In every surviving city, Sumerian, Egyptian, Mayan, and those nameless ruins now lost beneath dunes, someone stepped forward to fill the void. The heavens no longer spoke, so men learned to speak on their behalf. It began quietly. Caretakers tending temples, translators of law tablets, scribes entrusted with the final fragments of divine instruction. But as generations passed, the modest guardians of knowledge hardened into a new caste, a hierarchy whose power no sword could challenge because it was built not on armies, but on interpretation. To command belief is to outlive kings. The first acts of these priests were proclamations of continuity. They declared themselves intermediaries, chosen to maintain balance between humanity and the vanished gods. Yet, in the transition from witness to mouthpiece, something changed. Knowledge once shared freely as education became sacred commodity. Rites replaced instruction. Geometry, astronomy, metallurgy, the sciences that had once been the universal language of the builders, were rewritten into allegory only initiates could decipher. Maps of stars became calendars of festivals. Formulae turned to prayers. The deeper the people's hunger for the lost heavens, the higher the temples rose, and the more secretive those who built them became. In Sumer, the En priests encoded mathematical tables into hymns sung to Anu. The rhythms preserved ratios of planetary motion, though few listeners recognized it. In Egypt, the House of Life continued to copy texts whose meanings even the scribes scarcely understood, schematics disguised as psalms to the sun. Across the sea, temples in forgotten Andean valleys carved stories of the returners into stone, but hid their formulae behind symbolic beasts. Everywhere the same pattern repeated, revelation folding into ritual. Whether this transmutation was benevolent or manipulative depends on which fragments one chooses to believe. Some records suggest the priesthoods were genuinely desperate to protect dangerous knowledge from a world recently drowned by its misuse. They saw themselves as keeping fire away from children who had once nearly burned the sky. Others, less charitable, argue that secrecy became a drug. The code keepers realized that control over knowledge was control over survival. To ration truth meant to manufacture divinity. Over time, their networks intertwined. Pilgrims and scholars traveling between regions carried not just goods, but codes, shared symbols announcing membership in a hidden fraternity, a triangle within a circle, a serpent eating its tail, the scales of balance stretched by a single feather. Modern historians trace these motifs through millennia of art like fingerprints across an unrolled scroll. From Babylonian temples, they pass into the hands of Greek philosophers. From there, into esoteric sects of Rome, whispered through the Gnostics, raised again by medieval alchemists and the architects of cathedrals. Each age reinterpreted the inheritance, but never severed from it completely. A scroll found among the Dead Sea fragments speaks of an order of the veiled star, describing themselves as wardens of the commands from heaven's descent. Its encoded diagrams bear frightening resemblance to the energy maps carved under Giza. Another text, preserved in Arabic translation centuries later, tells of adepts who manipulate metal without flame and draw paths of the sky upon tablets of salt. To the superstitious, they were sorcerers. To the discerning, perhaps remnants of an earlier scientific priesthood, preserving fragments of metallurgy and electromagnetism couched in metaphor. Secrecy bred myth, and myth in turn gave birth to the notion of chosen bloodlines. The priests anointed kings, calling each new dynasty a pale echo of the gods who vanished. Yet the real continuity ran not through crowns, but through language. Words became passwords, rituals keys. Initiates of later mystery schools would swear oaths sealing their tongues, repeating formulas whose origins predated civilization. Even today, secret societies trace descent from teachers of light, said to have come before the first sunrise, echoing the same phrasing carved on the Andean stones at Titicaca. The lineage of guardianship persists, its hieroglyphs modernized into sigils, its temples disguised as academies, corporations, think tanks. Whether they protect the benediction of lost wisdom or the curse of forbidden technology remains uncertain. Some whisper that beneath their libraries, the ancient instruments of the god-kings still rest, sealed until humanity proves worthy again. Others fear the opposite, that those engines never slept, and the priesthood's real purpose is containment, not preservation. Whatever the truth, their shadows stretch from ziggurats to skyscrapers, a seamless priesthood draped across the centuries. They wear new robes now, lab coats, tailored suits. But the vow is the same. Keep the fire hidden, lest it burn the world twice. And so the echo of the vanished kings endures, not in the thunder of gods, but in the whispers of those who claim to speak for them, the enduring priesthood of disguise. Among the relics preserved by the early priesthoods, none stir more wonder than the fragments of hymns written not in tribute, but in command. They do not praise the gods, they instruct them. Each verse is measured like an equation, the vowels arranged in deliberate intervals, consonants struck as though carved to vibrate. Scholars once dismissed this precision as poetic rhythm. Only in recent decades, when physicists began translating vibration into visualization, did they realize how those chants embody the same harmonic ratios that govern resonance in matter itself. The ancients may have understood language not as metaphor, but as machinery, the word that quite literally shapes reality. Across surviving tablets from Sumer to the Indus, the same description repeats: the Mel Uru, the tongue of making. It was said to be the language spoken by the last divine ruler before the fall, that his voice could heal the torn earth and move walls as water. Myths rarely speak of technologies so directly. Some modern linguists, analyzing the surviving syllables, record frequencies that uncannily mirror vibrational nodes capable of altering sand and water patterns in laboratory cymatic experiments. When the vowels are sung in the ancient scale's exact pitch, forms appear in dust: spirals, double helixes, and rectangular grids reminiscent of temple blueprints. The geometries remember, even when translation fails. Where conventional writing captures ideas, the tongue of making appears to encode actions. In certain hymns, the moment of creation is rendered as sound preceding form, a note held until the dust arranged itself willingly. To believers, this was metaphor. To the few heretics who survived ancient censorship, it was instruction. They insisted that every tone carried an architecture, that one might carve stone not with blade or heat, but with harmonic pressure. Embedded in their visions are strange alignments between word and substance, each syllable married to an element, each phrase a mathematical sequence of air vibrations. The final king, Anka-Ru, was called the Singer of Worlds. Legends describe him standing before barren valleys, uttering measured tones until ground rippled and vegetation rose anew. Whether miracle or memory of lost science, those stories linger in structures that still hum with impossible resonance. Step inside certain megalithic chambers, and a whisper multiplies into a roar. Frequencies gather along specific walls and converge near the roof, where etched symbols translate as breath of life. Acoustic engineers who've tested these rooms find frequencies tuned to the anatomical resonance of the human chest cavity, the pitch of a human heart when calm. Perhaps time has eroded meaning, but not the design. Temples built as instruments, voices meant to play them. When the Sky Kings vanished, the priests inherited the music, but not the understanding. They hid their power behind dogma. What had once been creative science devolved into ritual song, holiness replacing technique. Chants of healing became prayers, geometric harmonics reduced to superstition. Yet the residue of that knowledge flows through culture like an underground river. Gregorian hymns, Tibetan overtones, the drone of Vedic recitation, all share the same harmonic ratios described on those shattered tablets. Each tradition claims spiritual origin, but their frequencies are almost identical, patterns older than written history, whispering the same forgotten mathematics. How could such parallelism survive without intent? Some suggest collective intuition. Others suspect guardianship, a priesthood ensuring the vibration never wholly dies. In cathedrals and mosques built on the ruins of earlier temples, the same acoustic proportions rise again. Domes amplifying voice into infinity, corridors tuned like flutes, The very buildings hum acknowledgments of an older order, a silent echo of voices once thought to command matter. If language truly could shape the world, perhaps it still does. Just quietly, dispersed among billions of speakers who no longer realize the power they wield with sound. Our earliest ancestors might have sung entire landscapes into being. We now speak without knowing that vowels still carry the physics of the stars. Deep beneath this everyday noise, a single tone may still wait, the one uttered by the last king before his empire fell, a frequency that held sky and stone together. The hymn fragments end abruptly, mid-phrase, as if silenced in the midst of creation. Somewhere within that unfinished note may lie the key to the oldest secret of all, that reality itself is still listening and remembers the song. When ancient scribes engraved the first maps of the heavens, one star symbol moved where none others should. They called it the crossing, the wanderer that slipped between orbits like a messenger defying boundaries. To us, it is a word teetering between myth and astronomy. Nibiru. To them, it was the throne from which the sky kings came, and to which they would one day return. For centuries, scholars categorized it as poetic license, another celestial metaphor rendered sacred by ignorance. But sky maps do not forget what eyes forget. And within the last decade, the instruments of scientists have begun to echo the tales of those long-dead watchers. In the frozen dark beyond Neptune, mathematical whispers have revealed the tug of an unseen presence. Planet 9, they name it, though no one has glimpsed it. Its gravity disrupts the orbits of smaller bodies at the edge of our solar system, bending them into obedience to a giant that hides itself in shadow. The data suggests an object 10 times the mass of Earth, following an elongated path that takes 12 to 15,000 years to circle the Sun, a period alarmingly close to the cycle stamped into the geological and mythic record alike. Every time this invisible world draws closest, climates convulse, magnetism trembles, entire species disappear. One could call it coincidence, but the pattern strikes like a drumbeat through time. Ancient texts chart similar dread rhythms. Cuneiform calendars describe a star that passes and discards the veil of heaven, warning of years when day becomes red and the waters rise. In Mesoamerican codices, a planet is drawn with twin tails and eyes of fire, vanishing beyond the rim of the sky only to return with reckoning. Even the Old Testament's apocalypses echo older words. Stars falling, seas screaming upward, judgment by fire and flood. All of them speak in poetry. All of them describe what science now calls a perturbation, an orbiting phantom whose arrival reorders worlds. The question that pulses within research halls and whispered circles alike is not whether this world exists, but what connection it bears to our own forgotten history. Did it merely brush too near once, fracturing climates and myths? Or was it the birthplace of the beings who appeared on Earth, already literate in the language of the sky? The Sumerians drew their gods, stepping from a disk with wings, the symbol of orbit. They said the monarch in Ka-Ru was Lord of the Crossing, half born of Earth and half of the traveler. Was that metaphor for mastery over cosmic knowledge, or a genealogical statement literal enough to make modern astronomers uneasy? If Planet 9, or Nibiru as the ancients called it, exists, its return is due soon by geological standards. Computer models show that its elongated orbit would bring it into the inner solar system roughly every 13,000 years. The very heartbeat of mass extinction and rebirth recorded in glacial ice and magnetic stone. The last approach aligns perfectly with that epic of fire, flood, and erased king. When the heavens darkened and the poles shuddered, Perhaps it was not just earthly hubris that condemned the old empire, but the rising gravity of a neighbor returning from its exile in the dark. Legends describe the Sky King's attempt to raise shields of light, to hold back the wandering throne. The words match oddly with what physicists know of charged magnetospheres. A civilization aware of the planet's cycle might indeed have tried to defend itself from solar storms induced by a massive body's approach. Failure would have meant more than doom. It would have meant memory scorched from human continuity. The flood, the fire, the long night of clouds, all could have followed naturally from such an astronomical trespass. If so, our ancestors did not imagine the crossing. They experienced it, survived it, and buried its terror in myth. And if those legends of descent and return preserve genuine cycles of visitation, then the cosmos operates like a pendulum, reminding life that creation and catastrophe share the same rhythm. Scientists now peer into that darkness, searching for the dim echo of light. Perhaps when they finally see it, when telescopes catch the glint of that far-flung wanderer, they will not merely discover a new planet. They will unlock a memory billions of cells old, the instinctive shiver we still feel when the heavens move. And we remember that the last king may have hailed from the void and fallen by the recurring shadow of his own world. Among the treasures recovered from Mesopotamian ruins, there exists a pattern so common that scholars long ago stopped seeing it for what it was. On cylinder seals and wall carvings, two serpents entwine around a central rod, looping upward in symmetrical coils. To historians, it was a symbol of health or divinity, later borrowed into Greek and Roman myth. But viewed through modern eyes, the resemblance is uncanny. The double helix rendered in stone long before a microscope was dreamed of. Its precision is not fanciful. It spirals with the correct pitch, the same dance of base pairs that forms the ladder of life itself. Again and again, the emblem appears beside the images of beings said to have given breath to clay. For decades, such coincidences were dismissed as retroactive imagination. Then biologists discovered something within our own blood that renewed the question. Human chromosome 2 contains a peculiar signature. Two ancestral chromosomes fused together. The event does not appear in other primates, and its fusion sites bear tiny cryptic sequences, snippets of non-coding DNA positioned like brackets around the join. They seem deliberate, less an evolutionary accident than an edit. Some geneticists refer to it privately as the insertion. It marks the moment when the human story diverged sharply from every earthly relative. The instant poetry described as the creation of man. If nature wrote us through mutation, this one page looks suspiciously redrafted. The odds of two chromosomes uniting so perfectly, without lethal defect, are astronomical. Yet it happened once. And the result was a species whose brain doubled in complexity within a geological blink. It granted our ancestors a mysterious jump. Language appearing, art flowering, civilizations kindling. What if those twin serpents were not metaphor, but memory of that editing? What if the breath of life was the hum of an encoded vibration reshaping our DNA? Sumerian myth credits the god kings with cutting the flesh of heaven into the clay of earth. Fragments from later tablets hint that one ruler governed the process, the guardian of the seed within seed. His name, partially lost, begins with the same forbidden syllables as the erased monarch, Anka. In priestly versions of the story, this act becomes sin, the theft of divine prerogative. Punishment follows: flood, exile, silence. But older versions read differently. There, the creation of humankind is an act of compassion, an attempt to repair the damaged world after catastrophic changes. The hybrid beings, our ancestors, were designed to endure a new atmosphere, heavier radiation, shifting magnetism. We were, in effect, an adaptation project. Archaeological oddities sharpen the riddle. In a sealed chamber near Kish, excavators cataloged bone fragments thicker and slightly denser than human bone, lacking precise match in any species. The site dates to the same era as the mythic experiments. Genetic testing on a sliver of preserved collagen revealed markers one step removed from human, but divorced from any known primate lineage. The sample disappeared before peer review was complete. What remains are field notes describing proteins consistent with accelerated cell repair mechanisms. The phrase lingers like an echo of that lost era's ambition. Across centuries, the priesthood turned such knowledge into sacred secrecy. The Temple of Eridu taught that the divine laws, were etched into every living being. To defy them was to invite ruin. Yet hidden within that dogma may lie a hint of context. These ancient scientists knew enough to fear their own invention. Perhaps the final king did not fall because he sought to enslave humanity, but because he interfered with its design. If he altered the template once more, trying to elevate endurance into divinity, he might have triggered mutation beyond control. The stories of men turning luminous, vanishing into heaven, could describe physical metamorphosis or radiation-driven transmutation. Modern DNA still bears faint scars. Within regions once thought junk, researchers observe repeating sequences of unknown origin, acting almost like commented lines in ancient code. Some silent, some switched on under environmental stress, they hint we are still living through an unfinished experiment. The genome remembers revision like the earth remembers fire. The twin serpents carved by forgotten hands were perhaps not symbols at all, but warnings, reminders that creation and engineering shared the same tool. Our very cells whisper the erased king's signature. Each divided chromosome carries his lost syllable folded within nucleotides. A promise, or perhaps a curse, that the human story is not yet written entirely by nature's hand. After the final king's disappearance, the tone of the world's oldest writings changed as though a tremor had passed through the collective mind of humanity. The tablets that once recorded inventions, laws, and the names of distant stars began speaking in guilt. Where earlier scribes celebrated the wisdom of the gods, later ones warned of it. Phrases like "me of the heavens," once meaning the sacred arts of calculation and construction, became transcribed as sins. The myths darkened, reshaping episodes of progress into cautionary fables. A veil dropped across culture, deliberate and total, the first act of collective amnesia. Neurologists now know that societies forget in much the same way a traumatized individual does. When events overwhelm comprehension, memory doesn't vanish. It rearranges itself. The brain creates substitute narratives to hold the pain at a distance. Generations inherit those narratives genetically and culturally until the truth is buried beneath parable. What emerged in the centuries after the cataclysm was precisely such a coping mechanism at species scale. Humanity built religion out of half-remembered instruction, turning science into miracle, teachers into gods, and warnings into commandments. The oldest morality stories read like therapy sessions conducted between epochs. The Epic of Atrahasis, for instance, tells of humans punished for knowing what is meant only for the stars. The Curse of Babel repeats the theme. A tower of knowledge erected, a language shattered to enforce forgetting. These texts are the record of a planet trying to protect itself from unbearable memory. That we were once altered, taught, perhaps even engineered by those who vanished. Forgetting became survival. Modern cognitive anthropology suggests that ritual is another form of encoded memory. By repeating action without needing to remember its reason, a culture preserves the skeleton of knowledge while erasing its face. Ancient temple ceremonies reproduce sequences that mimic astronomical alignments, sound resonances, even chemical reactions. Yet the officiants reciting them could not explain their purpose. They were reenacting instructions left over from an age when such performances maintained actual technologies. Each heritage chant, each seasonal festival, was a faint echo of processes that once stabilized weather, fertility, or health. That echo persisted long after the mechanisms became myth. Neuroimaging conducted on subjects exposed to rhythmic drumming and repetitive incantation shows patterned synchronization between hemispheres. A trance effect that opens the same neural pathways activated by deep memory recall. The ancients may not have understood neurology, but they practiced it instinctively. Civilizations became living brains, their rituals creating neural arcs across continents, firing information through generations in semi-coded trance language. The priests may have inherited these rituals without knowing they were operating the world's first distributed memory device. Cuneiform's own evolution reflects the forgetting. In early tablets, symbols for stars and mathematics intertwine. Celestial mechanics bound to story. Later, those two disciplines separate entirely. Astronomical references grow fewer, replaced by moral admonitions. The night sky ceased to be library and became judgmental witness. The stars were once coordinates, then confessions, and finally gods. Humanity had compartmentalized its trauma, hiding the forbidden knowledge in plain sight, reinterpreting the creators not as colleagues, but as betrayers. We became our own gatekeepers. Even so, the buried data never vanished. The myths of forbidden fruit, of Prometheus stealing fire, of Pandora opening the sealed jar, all carry the same residue. Curiosity as original sin, invention as rebellion. Within these myths, the memory of the king lives on, reframed as both savior and corrupter. Brain mapping of participants who read such stories shows unique electrical activity in the hippocampus, the region responsible for long-term recall. Symbolic tales do not merely entertain, they trigger inherited recognition, stirring responses as though touching an ancestral wound. Perhaps this explains why stories of lost civilizations, drowned continents, and star-born teachers resurface every few centuries. They are not fantasies created anew, but involuntary recollections rekindled whenever humanity grows technologically bold enough to echo its forgotten past. Memory pushes through repression like grass through asphalt. We tell the stories because some encoded survivor within our nervous system insists on it. It may be that the human brain itself was the final archive left by the vanished empire, biology repurposed into a vault durable enough to outlast floods and fire. Each of us carries encrypted impressions of a world that preceded writing, tools, and myth. In quiet dreams or sudden inspiration, these fragments still arise. Blueprints, without context, languages that hum in our blood, a longing for skies we have never visited but somehow recognize. We are the descendants of both the experiment and the experimenters, carrying their message not in tablets of stone, but in neurons that remember everything and tell us only what we can bear to know. At the bottom of the world, where wind razors across white plains and night can last half a year, the ice keeps better secrets than stone ever could. For centuries, Antarctica was treated as a frozen void, lifeless save for penguins and the occasional expeditionary tragedy. But then the ice began speaking, not with voice, but through drill cores pulled from depths that had never seen air. In those cylinders of translucent time, scientists found stories written in trapped gas, ancient dust, and microscopic fossils. the deepest samples stunned them. Pollen from species that could only exist in warm, humid forests. Fragments of diatoms that thrived in sunlit seas. 12,000 years ago, the poles were not white, but green. And then, without warning, they froze almost overnight. The transition layer in those cores is razor-thin, less than an inch thick, marking something closer to a catastrophe than a climate trend. Radioactive isotopes spike briefly, hinting at cosmic bombardment or a burst of radiation from the sun. Below that line, sea salts vanish. Above it, the world turns to ice. Whatever happened, it was swift enough to entomb entire ecosystems before bacteria could decompose them. Some scientists theorized a meteor strike. Others suggested violent pole shift. Yet one detail complicates every model: the geometry imprinted beneath the ice. In 2016, satellites scanning for mineral anomalies along Queen Maud Land began mapping a pattern invisible to human eyes: hexagonal magnetic structures arranged in concentric symmetry. Analysts at first assumed natural crystalline formations. But as resolution improved, those columns revealed proportions that no glacier should produce. Ratios matching the sacred geometry used in Sumerian temple design. The same mathematics repeated beneath Giza and along the axes of the Andean stone library. Nature is elegant, but it is rarely redundant across continents. Someone built using the same measure wherever they went. By 2018, a consortium of polar researchers requested permission to bore through the section known as Dome C to investigate a possible impact crater rumored to coincide with the magnet anomaly. Their request was denied. Logistics, the officials claimed. Poor weather conditions. The following year, satellite access around that coordinate was quietly restricted. Images blurred under security protocols normally reserved for military installations. A few whistleblowers within those same circles leaked brief notes to journalists. That subglacial radar had detected not a crater, but voids, structures, arranged under 2 miles of ice, aligned to cardinal points within a margin of error, smaller than a compass needle. Accounts vary, but the descriptions converge. Some speak of domes, others of tunnels glazed smooth as obsidian, branching outward like spokes on a wheel. One engineer claimed the data showed internal heat persistent and localized, as though something beneath still generated warmth. Governments promptly classified the results. Officially, no unusual radar readings exist. Unofficially, declarations of global scientific cooperation at the poles now come wrapped in military oversight. The secrecy has only deepened curiosity. What could lie 2 miles below that would reorder history if revealed? Patterns in the data imply deliberate proportion. The same harmonic scaling embedded in temples dedicated to Anu and his kin. The connection has birthed wild hypotheses. That the last followers of the erased king fled south when the floods came, seeking haven near magnetic poles to ride out planetary upheaval. That the city, under the ice, was a technological ark preserving what remained of their civilization. The sudden freeze, then, would not be accident, but containment, entombing whatever survived. In Cold War archives, there are rumors of early reconnaissance flights returning with photographs of hexagonal walls gleaming under thin ice before the zone was declared off limits. All such films have since deteriorated. To the skeptic, it is fantasy, expeditions imagining warmth in endless cold. Yet core sample data insists the land once teemed with forests the color of emeralds. If a refuge existed there, its destruction or preservation may mark the true end of the first global age. Beneath Antarctica's silence might sleep the literal tomb of the Sky King, preserved not in legend but in permafrost, waiting for the world to thaw enough to remember him. And as temperatures rise each decade, cracks run deeper across the glaciers, groaning in tones that resemble something immense turning in its sleep. Sometimes, the most dangerous truths are not buried under rubble, but under ice, patient, enduring, and about to wake. When the old empires finally disintegrated into dust and language, their stories did not vanish. They migrated. The myths traveled along trade routes and refugee trails, crossing deserts and mountains until they resurfaced in new tongues, wearing new names. The marks of the vanished kings began appearing in unexpected scripture, first as echoes, then as doctrine. By the time the descendants of Mesopotamia wrote the earliest Hebrew texts, the distance between history and holiness had narrowed to a thin veil of translation. Yet beneath careful edits and faith's reverent polish, the bones of an older myth still glowed. The genealogies of Genesis carry lifespans measured not in decades, but in centuries. Patriarchs who lived 900 years, fathers who begat sons after impossible ages. This was not arbitrary symbolism. In Sumerian king lists, those same lengths appear, scaled down only slightly. Each patriarch's reign, each righteous man's extraordinary age, mirrors the records of god-kings before the deluge. Adapa, Alulim, Enoch, Methuselah. They form a single, continuous line disguised by evolving alphabets. Enoch's mysterious departure, he walked with God and was no more, even repeats the phrasing used for the ascension of Enka-Ru, the erased monarch said to have risen in light. What religion calls divine favor may well memorialize a disappearance the ancients once witnessed literally. An ascent from earth into the heavens that belief later reinterpreted as transcendence. The process of translation was both preservation and sanitization. As tribes absorbed the shards of Mesopotamian lore, their scribes faced a task: to keep the spiritual memory intact while purging it of blasphemous implication. The gods became God, transformed from a council of luminous engineers into a singular, ineffable power. Their technologies became miracles, their departures divine will instead of evacuation. Cosmic events, a flood, a fiery sky, plagues of darkness, turned into moral instruments wielded by a just creator. It was history rewritten so humanity could worship without terror, yet subconsciously remembering its terror through worship. Even the shadow races of the Old Testament show their lineage. The Anakim, described as towering beings inhabiting Canaan's hills, share both name and nature with the Anunnaki. In older Sumerian texts, those were the lords who descended, part of the pantheon of sky beings who supervised creation. In Hebrew hands, the Anunnaki became the Anakim, fallen giants expunged by righteous conquest. Linguists note the root Anak aligns perfectly with Anuk or Anunnaki in phonetic evolution. The story altered its moral polarity, but not its structure. The ancient benefactors recast as menacing watchmen to justify their erasure. Where one culture saw teachers, another saw threats. Moses' account of Sinai likewise holds strange resonances. Mountains wreathed in smoke, a trembling ground, pillars of fire marking the deity's descent. These read as dramatized descriptions of descent vehicles retold through theological vocabulary. The people could not approach because the glory of the Lord was a consuming fire. Earlier, Akkadian scripts described the Anunnaki craft exactly so. Radiance that burned by proximity, vibration mistaken for thunder. The tablet's black stone containing commandments may have been something literal once. A crystalline data storage or alloy tablet later mythologized into moral law. When the later priests assembled the Torah, they preserved the pattern but erased the mechanics, translating machine into miracle. This rewriting was not deception, but survival. A people traumatized by divine abandonment needed cosmic order, not scattered gods vanishing into storms. So memory became scripture, caution wrapped in reverence. Yet even as theologians polished the stories, vestiges of the original knowledge slipped through like light between fingers. References to the Watchers, to pillars joining heaven and earth, to covenants written in the very flesh of humanity. They are fingerprints of that pre-deluge world pressed into the clay of new faiths. If the Old Testament's purpose was moral education, its subtext is something vaster, a code chronicling celestial events through human metaphors. The divine wrath, the angelic messengers, the chosen few rescued from flood or fire. All preserve data about magnetic reversals, comets, and colonial retirements of beings who once ruled in daylight. Religion became memory's disguise, wrapping our origin story inside parables digestible by innocence. And while belief moved forward into worship, the shadow of the ninth planet, the echo of the erased monarch, lingered beneath every amen, reminding that faith itself may be the most enduring technology the old empire ever left behind. A narrative encryption system powerful enough to protect truth through millennia of forgetting. In the ruins of Nineveh, there lies a fragment of fired clay so small it could fit in a hand. Yet its etched lines unfold like the itinerary of eternity. It is an omen tablet, one of thousands consulted by court astronomers to read the moods of gods through the language of sky. Most record familiar warnings: illness, famine, falling kings. But one bears a passage so unique that even in translation it vibrates. When the crimson star returns from the road beyond darkness, the crown of heaven shall descend again, and kingship shall be renewed upon the earth. Scholars filed it among mythic astrological predictions until modern astronomy unexpectedly nodded in agreement. High above our planet, beyond the familiarity of the visible constellations, lies a cluster where something extraordinary occurs. Roughly every 13 millennia, the dying glow of a red star intensifies, flashing across the sky bright enough to stain the night with blood-colored light. For weeks it dominates the heavens before fading into obscurity again. Ancient civilizations from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica record similar occurrences: the Eye of Fire, the Heart of the Serpent, the Traveler's Gate, each citing catastrophic floods and celestial renewals coinciding with its appearance. To dismiss the repetition as coincidence is to ignore an unsettling rhythm tied not just to myth, but to measured physics. Astrophysicists now confirm that several variable red supergiants near Earth's orbital plane undergo cyclical flaring as gravitational tides align between neighboring systems. From our vantage, that chain reaction would indeed blaze crimson, visible even to naked eyes. The last recorded surge appears in radiocarbon isotopes dating to roughly 11,000 BCE. The very period of the global deluge, pole disruption, and the erasure of the Sky King from every register. Sumerian texts did not calculate with modern mathematics, yet their priests kept remarkably accurate records of celestial timing, corrected by meticulous observations carved across generations. When that omen tablet spoke of the return, it may have recorded empirical data, the prediction of another flare, another world reset. In temple tradition, the crimson star was not destruction, but annunciation. It signaled a gateway, a returning court of heaven bearing kingship, the same office once held by the god-kings who ruled before the flood. The language suggests orbital metaphor. The return star's approach meant geometric resonance between worlds, an alignment restoring exchange between sky and earth. Yet for cultures lacking our vocabulary for cosmic mechanics, restoration of kingship became shorthand for reconnection with their absent founders. The final king, vanished amid storm and fire, was said to ride this crimson path, to ascend the burning river, promising one day to descend again when the heavens reopened. Every repetition of the stars blazing may thus represent synchronization, an invisible cosmic heartbeat that times both catastrophe and rebirth. If the cycle truly spans 13,000 years, as geological and mythic evidence alike propose, then the interval since the last appearance has nearly elapsed. Astronomers today track irregularities in dust clouds around Betelgeuse and Antares. Their models suggest a coming outburst remarkably consistent with the ancient prediction, perhaps within centuries, perhaps sooner. When it appears again, it will seem as though prophecy has kept appointment. Of course, the Omens authors did not speak of astrophysics. They spoke of destiny. They believed the red star's light carried within it the memory of divine order, a rehearsal of cosmic creation. Modern readers can translate it as cyclic realignment, a resetting of orbital energy patterns that subtly alter the planet's climate and magnetic architecture. The ancients translated it as the rebirth of divine authority. Both might be true in different languages. What they experienced as gods returning from heaven could have been nothing more, or nothing less, than the great engine of the solar system completing its circuit, drawing space and consciousness into resonance. If Ankaru was indeed bound to that cycle, perhaps he was messenger, guardian, or even casualty of its power. His disappearance during the last eruption might have been withdrawal through this alignment into the very rhythm that will soon resonate again. The next dawn, when a crimson star glows on the edge of the night, we may stand in the same light that bathed lost kingdoms and understand, briefly, why they believed kingship came from heaven. Because sometimes the heavens truly answer back. When the ruins of Ur were first mapped by Sir Leonard Woolley nearly a century ago, he declared that nothing more could be found beneath its ziggurat except the dead. His neat stratigraphic drawings seemed to close the city's story forever. Yet technology has a talent for reviving ghosts. And in the last decade, a new generation of archaeologists returned armed not with trowels, but with pulses of invisible light. Ground-penetrating radar swept beneath the ancient precinct, and what it revealed contradicts every assumption about how far back civilization reaches. Beneath the familiar mud-brick strata, layers of temples, tombs, and workshops already catalogued, a set of linear echoes appeared, angles too clean, corridors too consistent to be natural. The imaging, run initially as a geological survey, shows a perfect rectangle nearly 90 meters on a side, sealed in solid clay. Every edge aligns to true north within less than a single degree, an accuracy the ancients should not have achieved under tons of collapsing architecture. The lines are brighter than expected, reflecting uncommonly dense material. In the radar's false color images, the chambers glow in pale golds and greens, a spectral architecture beneath the visible city. Officially, the results remain under review, with excavation plans delayed pending heritage impact analysis. Unofficially, an embargo has descended. Dig permits once approved in weeks now languish for years. When pressed, ministry officials insist the anomaly represents a natural formation, a hardened salt lens, perhaps, left by ancient floods. Yet internal memos leaked from the regional archives speak of something else. One report cites artifacts inconsistent with known metallurgy recovered from core borings. Another mentions evidence of electromagnetic interference affecting instruments. The language is dry, almost bureaucratic, but between the lines stirs unease. Local rumor fills the silence. Laborers in nearby digs whisper of crates shipped at night to Basra under military guard. One technician claims a bore camera lowered into a fracture glimpsed smooth black stone with writing that moved in light. The recording supposedly failed when extracted, corrupted by static. No images have surfaced, only the persistent gossip that beneath Ur lies not another layer of ruin, but a vault. One built with a precision beyond its time, entombed intentionally to outlast apocalypse. The location itself feeds suspicion. In Sumerian cosmology, Ur was the seat of kingship, the earthly mirror of heaven's court. If the gods ever walked upon the earth, they walked here. To discover a hidden structure beneath such a city would be like finding machinery under myth. Some researchers quietly describe the chamber as the burial hall of the last king, the same monarch whose name was erased from every tablet. If true, his grave would not be a resting place, but a laboratory sealed against the end of an age. Drilled samples from the surrounding clay collected anomalous particles. Traces of silica alloy hardened to something approaching modern ceramics, impossible for Bronze Age kilns. Laboratory. Spectra show ratios resembling compounds used in high-temperature engineering, though contamination has not been ruled out. Even so, the implications are staggering. Either the city concealed a technology somehow rediscovered millennia early, or it inherits fragments from a culture already forgotten when Ur itself was born. In the shadow of the ziggurat, archaeologists still walk the sand, outwardly patient but haunted by the sense of something vast beneath their boots. Nighttime temperature shifts bring gentle tremors through the soil, faint but rhythmic, as if the buried structure expands and contracts with the earth's breath. Sensors sometimes register a low-frequency hum, the same tone noted in sealed megalithic chambers half a world away. Engineers chalk it up to wind resonance, yet that explanation feels thin. Perhaps the silence surrounding the discovery is not purely political. If the vault beneath Ur truly holds relics of the erased king, machines forged from forgotten alloys, matrices storing languages or energies beyond our comprehension, it would rewrite humanity's history in one exhalation. Better, perhaps, for governments to delay, to pretend the strangeness is geological. Yet legends persist that one day pressure from the shifting Euphrates will crack the protective clay, revealing doors that have not opened since the flood receded. And when light finally pours through, the city of Ur may speak again, not in hymns or prophecy, but in the unmistakable voice of its maker, metallic, resonant, and alive. Long before the final storms, when memory and mathematics were one language, music was not art at all, but calibration. Ancient scribes wrote that the last divine kings tuned the heavens as lutes of gold. At first glance, the phrase belongs to myth, but the relics unearthed from temple vaults argue otherwise. Surviving harps and lyres discovered in Sumerian graves are too precise to be accidental. Their strings are spaced at ratios that correspond exactly to orbital harmonics between planets: 4:3, 5:8, 13:21. When played, even reconstructed in modern replicas, their tones mirror the measured frequencies of planetary revolutions converted into audible range. The ancients had crafted the universe into song. Modern physics describes those proportions as resonance stabilizers, relationships that govern not only melody, but also the structure of matter. Orbital mechanics hum according to the same ratios that composers call consonant intervals. Johannes Kepler half-remembered it when he named his treatise Harmonices Mundi, the harmony of the world, insisting planets produced chords as they moved. He credited God with orchestration, but perhaps he was deciphering a refrain composed long before theology existed. If harmony rules the cosmos, it might once have been consciously maintained. Legends surrounding Enka-Ru claim he wielded sound as both weapon and bomb. He brought the air into obedience, reads one hymn, and chaos stilled before his tone. After the Great Pole Shift, when magnetic fields fluctuated wildly, civilizations that endured would have faced a sky crackling with auroras and thunder. To restore atmospheric stability, they might have used resonance, sound against turbulence, rhythm against entropy. Vast instruments carved into the earth. Ziggurats shaped like resonant chambers, canals laid out as tuning forks gathering wind. To later generations, they became temples and sacred groves. But to their builders, they were tools. Within the subterranean structure beneath sensors occasionally catch frequencies in the infrasonic range. Below human hearing, yet within the band known to influence molecular alignment. It may be coincidence, wind through hollow corridors, or it may be the residue of a technology that once synchronized planet, air, and heartbeat. Researchers have observed that prolonged exposure to these low tones can induce calm, clarity, even altered perception, side effects suspiciously similar to what priests once called divine communion. If the chambers under still hum faintly, perhaps they are continuing work no one remembers how to measure. Cross-cultural parallels strengthen the theory. Himalayan singing bowls, Greek monochords, Aboriginal didgeridoos, all emit fundamental frequencies identical to key orbital ratios. Even the Gregorian scale, devised millennia later in cloisters half a world away, centers itself on the same mathematical progression found in early Sumerian notation. Somehow, these ratios survived cultural collapse again and again, coded into prayer and music. The people forgot the equations, but kept the melodies. Acousticians studying megalithic corridors at Malta and Malta's distant twins in Peru report that the chambers amplify particular notes while canceling others, creating sonic standing waves that vibrate precisely at 110 Hz. The frequency of a relaxed human alpha brain state. The architects seem to know those properties consciously, shaping stone so it answered voices rather than echoing them. To speak aloud within is to feel your chest lightened, your pulse aligning. Perhaps this was the afterimage of the king's lost craft, tuning body, earth, and sky into the same rhythm so existence would not disintegrate again. In that sense, tuning the heavens may have been neither grand metaphor nor superstition. It was maintenance. A planetary orchestra constantly in need of retuning after each disaster thrusts its instruments out of harmony. When he disappeared, the conductor's baton fell silent, and the world's harmonies decayed. Storm followed storm, civilizations rose and faltered, each invention an attempt, knowingly or not, to recreate the lost tones. Today, physicists record faint oscillations in Earth's magnetic field corresponding to musical intervals. Lightning strokes generate Schumann resonances whose multiples match the same ancient ratios. Whether coincidence or inheritance, the effect is haunting. Each thunderclap reverberates in the key of our own origin. Perhaps that is why every culture fills its silences with rhythm. Drums echo a planetary memory, songs reach upward to retune invisible strings, and across time, humanity continues humming a lullaby once meant for the sky itself. The music of the spheres never died. We have simply forgotten that we are part of the orchestra. By the time the industrial world turned its attention to the crumbling mounds of Mesopotamia, the age of god-kings had been entombed for thousands of years. Yet something about those barren hills seemed to whisper back, and the first archaeologists who dug there felt they were unearthing more than history. They were resurrecting memory itself. In the 1830s and 1840s, explorers from Britain, France, and the Ottoman provinces began filling their journals with sketches of winged figures, strange inscriptions, and chips of alloy unlike any metal known in their own factories. They were convinced they stood on the threshold of a discovery too large for their century. Within decades, most were gone. The pattern always repeated. A report filed with a museum describing implements of curious metallic nature would be followed by silence. Teams that had been well-funded suddenly lost backing, their patrons withdrawing overnight. In one case, a scholar named Hamilton recorded in his notebook the retrieval of an object he called a mirrored valve. A thin plate covered in intersecting grooves he insisted were not decorative but functional. Days after writing the entry, he vanished en route from Mosul to Basra. Official accounts listed fever. Local rumor claimed armed men waylaid his caravan and retrieved what he carried. His books arrived in London without the final pages, the section detailing the object torn neatly out. Throughout the 19th century, such incidents accumulated like ghost footnotes. An assistant at the British Museum recounted crates arriving labeled statues, but weighing far too little. Inside, he found smooth cylinders of unknown alloy, sealed with pitch, later removed under military escort. The museum's registrar ordered the entry rewritten to list them as limestone cores. His confusion earned him dismissal within the week. Even the newspapers of the day played their part, printing polite obituaries for explorers who had by all eyewitness accounts survived. A mining engineer from Naples allegedly drowned in the Tigris, though letters from his wife mentioned his plans to meet a spiritual society in Paris months later. None of his correspondence after that survives. It would be easy to blame imperial rivalries and theft, and perhaps greed played its role. Yet the precision of the erasures suggests intent beyond politics. The suppression of inconvenient discoveries mirrors what those early tablets once recorded about imperial scribes scraping names from history. Millennia after the king's exile, the guardians of narrative still protect the boundary between permitted myth and forbidden memory. Archives in London, Paris, and Istanbul each hold letters hinting at sealed deposits stored somewhere off-record. A few scholars whisper that the missing artifacts were neither destroyed nor stolen, but relocated into private vaults belonging to institutions older than the museums themselves. Societies formed during the fever for Egyptology, whose founding charters declare their purpose the preservation of relics of celestial contact. To the public, they were fraternities of gentlemen. To their members, they were inheritors of the priesthood of disguise. Toward the century's end, a final mystery tightened the pattern. In 1899, an excavation in the ruins of Kish briefly produced a mechanical fragment, a set of gilt gears fused by age. The single photograph published in a local paper disappeared from archives a month later, the negative replaced by a note. Withdrawn under ministry instruction. The field team dispersed. 2 emigrated. 1 entered an asylum after claiming they had woken the stone that hums. When researchers revisited the site in the 20th century, they found it sealed under concrete by the military, declared hazardous due to unexploded ordnance from wars that had never been fought there. Few modern academics discuss these events openly. To do so risks reputation. To verify them risks intervention from forces more bureaucratic than sinister. Yet the coincidence is unmistakable. Every age that edges too close to rediscovering its true lineage finds its dig sites suddenly shuttered, its evidence lost inside locked rooms and falsified ledgers. Perhaps the warnings carved in cuneiform, that knowledge must be guarded, did not die with the scribes, but were inherited by new custodians. If so, the chain of secrecy extends unbroken from mud brick to modern steel vault, the same hand-drawing veils across centuries. And somewhere behind those veils, beneath fluorescent lamps instead of torches, lies the missing proof. Metal gleaming softly, as if waiting for courage to touch it again. For as long as anyone has studied the clay fragments of Babylonian astronomy, it was assumed that the stars inscribed upon them referred only to what ancient scholars could see with the naked eye. Their constellations served calendars, harvest rites, and portents for kings. Practical divination, nothing more. But the recent deciphering of a particular tablet, broken into 5 pieces and reassembled in a museum drawer where it had lain since the 1920s, has forced that certainty into collapse. Carved into its surface is a map so mathematically precise that even modern instruments barely equal its accuracy. The star positions recorded correspond not to the skies of 2000 BCE, but to configurations 13,000 years apart. Epochs perfectly matching the intervals between Earth's known cataclysms. Graduate student first recognized the anomaly, noticing that the declinations differed by a fraction inconsistent with simple transcribing error. When corrected for precessional movement, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, the coordinates aligned to the night sky just prior to the last ice collapse. Whoever created the tablet knew the concept of precession more than a millennium before Hipparchus, and they used it deliberately. The implication: Babylonia's stargazers were decoding a legacy far older than their own civilization. The clay does not preserve discovery, it preserves remembrance. As scholars reconstructed the incomplete text, a pattern emerged beneath the numerical data. A repeating cycle labeled renewal of the firmament. Every 12,160 years, a full turn of what modern science calls the precessional age. The document predicted Earth's trembling and the rivers of fire, followed by the recrowned heavens. One line midway through the cuneiform spiral delivers a simple instruction: mark well the crimson rising, for it heralds the new order of kings. The red star again, the same omen that tracked through legends of the flood, through the erasure of the Sky King, through the alignment of broken worlds. More unsettling still are the margins. Around the main cartographic field run dozens of smaller glyphs, personal marks left by the scribe. At first, they seemed decorative. Tiny, repeated discs etched with 3 concentric circles. Under magnification, the outer ring revealed a miniature sequence of notches corresponding to orbital fractions also present on tablets from Ur, describing the measurement of Nibiru. Between those rings lies a symbol known only from forbidden contexts: the seal of An-Ka-Ru, the vanished monarch whose name was prescribed even as myth. The astronomer who copied this chart either preserved or risked their life to acknowledge that seal, as if signing the work on behalf of a lineage extending back beyond the flood. Modern mathematicians examining the ratios in the star map confirm that the tablet encodes more than directions. It holds algorithmic instructions for calculating axial drift and gravitational perturbations. It is, in blunt scientific terms, a formula for predicting not only astronomical cycles, but the ensuing environmental crises they trigger. Tides, magnetism, atmospheric collapse. Each follows the heartbeat of the cosmos. The ancient astronomers had not been mystics, but archivists, guardians of planetary memory. After every disaster, they rebuilt the table and adjusted the future date of renewal. For them, prophecy was prediction. If the code's arithmetic holds, the next renewal coincides closely with the orbital return of the crimson star, somewhere within the coming millennium. Hidden in its numerical lattice is a phrase repeated across fragments: "Those who forget shall be reset." The bluntness chills more than any prophecy. It reads like the logic of a machine left, running. Perhaps the Sky Kings created it as safeguard, or warning, or both. Perhaps An-Ka-Ru inscribed his symbol not as signature, but as authorization, the mark of one who understood that every civilization, given time, forgets too much. When the translation was finalized, the museum quietly withdrew the paper. The official explanation cites cataloging misattribution. Copies of the high-resolution scan circulated briefly online before vanishing. Still, the decoded coordinates travel among researchers like a rumor. Each points toward the same conclusion recorded in brittle clay thousands of years ago. History is not linear, but harmonic, tuned to a cosmic timepiece that resets worlds at its own tempo. Across the stars, the countdown continues, the astronomer's code ticking silently toward its next renewal, while humanity, once again, forgets that it already knows the tune. Among the tablets that survive the burning of Nineveh, there exists a series so strange that early translators assumed they described hallucination. They speak of a device once kept at the heart of the palace, a wheel of fire by which the king commands the breath of heaven. For generations, scholars filed these texts under mythology, seeing in them the poetic embroidery of Scripture. The Gate of Winds was taken to mean prophecy, and the wheel itself became emblem of divine authority. Yet modern philologists, tracing the roots of the original Sumerian and Akkadian words, discovered the term for wheel shares derivation not with chariots or sun disks, but with instruments of rotation and energy, mechanisms. What if poetry was camouflage for technology? Fragments of bas-relief accompanying the texts depict a circular frame studded with repeating motifs that look uncannily like gears, and a central hub adorned with flames rendered as radiating lines. One slab shows the king standing beside the apparatus, his right hand extended toward a series of nested rings. Around them, attendants hold stylized jars with narrow spouts, vessels scholars long described as offerings. But analysis of residue on similar artifacts found at Ur suggests those could have contained oleum or mercury, both conductive fluids capable of generating electrical phenomena. Could the jars have been components, primitive capacitors feeding the wheel of fire? In the ruins of Nimrud, another carving adds to the mystery. A funnel-shaped structure positioned over what looks like water channels or coiled tubing. The inscription reads, "From the deep it feeds, from the air it draws, until the land breathes." For years this line was translated as metaphor for irrigation, yet it aligns eerily with principles of atmospheric electrolysis. It is possible the device functioned as an early reactor, releasing charged ions into the sky to stabilize climate after the deluge. The Gate of Winds then would not be a portal to heaven, but an engineered weather system, a means of controlling pressure and perhaps even magnetic polarity. If the so-called king's divine scepter was the control rod of this system, his ability to summon storms or quell drought would be indistinguishable from godhood. The priests who tended such machinery would appear as magicians to later generations. When the mechanism failed or was dismantled after the cataclysm, the memory of its operation could only survive as myth. A holy engine transforming elements under the will of the heavens. Supporting evidence hides in plain sight across museums. Objects catalogued as ritual diadems or shields bear chemical traces of hot filtration and metal casting far beyond Bronze Age capability. Gold leaf fused to unknown composites without hammering. Residual magnetization in stone carvings which should not conduct at all. In the British Museum's Mesopotamian Hall, one tablet mislabeled as an altar shows concentric spirals etched with mathematical precision, their spacing proportional to logarithmic curves. It is effectively a schematic, the kind an engineer would recognize instantly, but an art historian would ignore. These were not symbols of faith. They were instructions, maintenance manuals disguised as scripture to outwit ignorance. There are even accounts of reawakening the wheel, ceremonies enacted every solstice when the priests sang syllables corresponding to resonant frequencies known today to enhance plasma discharge. Catherine wheel firework designs may descend from those rites, miniature imitations of a once functional device that balanced heaven's magnetism. As the story leaks from translation into speculation, one uncomfortable idea persists. Perhaps Ankaru's power to rule sun and storm was not supernatural, but scientific mastery, an understanding of resonance and energy so advanced that it seemed divine. If he truly used the wheel of fire to open the gate of winds, that might explain the polarity disasters and volcanic lightning recorded at the fall of his age. A reactor pushed beyond limit, misinterpreted by witnesses as heaven unchained. Every civilization since has carved circular mandalas, solar discs, or halos, subconsciously rebuilding the wheel in miniature, longing for the lost equilibrium it once provided. The ancients called it creation. We might call it technology. Both names describe the same miracle: light harnessed, chaos ordered, life sustained. And perhaps, even now, buried beneath layers of clay and reverence, the machine of creation waits. Its gears fused but patient, dreaming in metal of a time when humanity again dares to turn it on. Among the many relics of the vanished empire, perhaps none are as insidious as those that tick and count. Every calendar is a story about control, and every count of years a mirror of who commands the present. When the Sky Kings disappeared, it wasn't only thrones that stood empty. The rhythm by which the world measured itself collapsed. Harvests became erratic. Solstices drifted out of sync, and the heavens no longer matched the records carved into clay. To restore order, the surviving priesthood convened what later traditions remembered as the Council of Renewal. Its task was not coronation, but recalibration, the rewriting of time. The oldest fragments describing this council come from temple libraries in Sippur and Nippur, both sites devoted to the study of celestial cycles. They tell of scholars and prophets who gathered after the deluge to settle the wandering of the days. Their decision, preserved in poetic language, shortened the year, compressing lunar and solar cycles to create an artificial symmetry. Where once the year spanned a longer course, perhaps 360 true days plus intercalary periods, they removed or obscured the adjustments. Time, as humanity perceives it, became a deliberate fiction. At first, the alteration must have seemed minor, an act of administrative necessity. Yet by forcing new calendars to fit the sun's disobedient motions, the priests condensed history itself. Dynasties that ruled for centuries appeared to last mere decades. Catastrophes separated by millennia became neighborhood memories of a single disaster. When later civilizations built upon these records, they inherited an already warped chronology. The rebirth of agriculture, metallurgy, even writing, events we call beginnings, may have been returns. Whole ages were folded inward like pages glued together. The motivation for such deception was not purely theological. Astronomical records suggest that after the last polar upheaval, Earth's rotation may indeed have changed slightly, days lengthening by fractions of seconds, enough over millennia to confuse measurement. But the Council's actions went beyond correction. They erased intermediate epochs outright. Columns of numbers vanish from king lists just as names vanish from dynasties. Entire centuries dissolved between reigns. To later generations, it looked like divine wrath sweeping clean the ledger of history. In truth, it was editorial. Modern scientists performing retro calculations of precessional movement, tracking backward the slow wobble of Earth's axis, find that ancient star observations should date thousands of years earlier than accepted. Temples allegedly built in 2500 BCE are aligned to constellations visible only around 10,000 BCE. Rather than assume impossible precision, historians compress the data, arguing misinterpretation. Yet what if the misinterpretation is ours? What if the priests who standardized time shifted the zero point of history itself, sliding humanity forward along an invented scale until memory caught up with obedience? Within secret archives of Renaissance chronologists, there survive rumors of lost texts from Babylon, listing previous worlds before ours, epochs named the Ages of Recounting. Scholars who studied them noticed that each reboot was followed by new calendars, new gods, and new claims of being the first civilization. Each era believed it was young because the keepers of history demanded youth. Immortality of species might be unbearable. Renewal was more manageable. The council's reforms spread quietly across continents. Egyptian scribes adopted the 360-day year divided by 12. The Maya encoded 260-day ritual cycles nested within vast cosmic counts, perhaps fragments of the older, truer measure. Even modern calendars echo the architecture of that decision. Our numbered years trick us into believing continuity. But if the priests compressed enough time, we may inhabit a chronology many thousands of years older than we think. The 21st century could be a cosmetic label pinned to the twilight of a six-figure age. If that is true, the manipulation of time was never about mathematics alone. It was protection. By erasing evidence of previous rises and collapses, the priesthood granted humanity the illusion of a single upward path, unbroken by cycles of forgetting. To know how many ages came before might encourage fatalism or rebellion. Better that we live as children believing ourselves at the beginning. Yet deep in geological layers, in fossils and magnetized rock, the planet maintains its own unedited chronicle, a record immune to calendars and councils. When we finally read it completely, we may discover that our modern world is only the latest revision of an endlessly rewritten script. Time as censorship, chronology as comfort, and the true age of humankind draped in deliberate amnesia. In the catalogs of the world's earliest astronomers, there is a constellation no longer visible, a cluster of lights once positioned like a crown above Sagittarius, noted briefly in surviving fragments and then forgotten. The Babylonians called it Ankar-U, the royal crossing, drawn as a seven-pointed circlet around a brighter central sun. Even the most conservative translators admit the name is almost identical to the syllables forbidden on Earth. The erased ruler's title broken into stars. It seems the first astronomers not only traced the gods across the heavens, but placed their exiled king among them. Yet somewhere between the fall of Nineveh and the rise of Greece, his constellation disappeared. The loss cannot be blamed completely on imagination. Earth's slow axial precession gradually drifts the celestial sphere, and after 12 or 13,000 years, entire constellations shift out of alignment or slip beneath the horizon. But what troubles scholars is that Ankaru survives as terminology centuries after its supposed disappearance, suggesting it was struck deliberately from the zodiac, long before sight vanished naturally. Celestial atlases that reappear in Greek and early Persian astronomy show obvious deletions, a gap suspiciously between known star groups, filled later by mythic fragments of Corona Australis. The Greeks named it simply the Southern Crown, as if to preserve its shape while erasing its owner. The erasure of a name on tablets can vanish a man. Erasing his star ensures eternity forgets his address. In temple astronomy, a constellation was more than decoration. It marked geography in the heavens, mirrored to the geometry of cities below. Priests built sanctuaries aligned not to superstition, but to light from specific stars at specific times. To delete one alignment meant rewriting the map of prayer itself, changing the flow of ritual energy measured through light and shadow. When Ankaru was removed, new temples reoriented. Statues of kings no longer faced the southern sky, but the east. The heavens, as humanity knew them, were rewritten to exclude a single name, a celestial damnatio memoriae. Some scattered clay tablets escaped this revision. One, cracked and singed, found near Babylon's Esagila School of Astronomy, preserves a sketch of the crown stars with calculations for a cycle described as the return of the royal breath. The patterns suggest the cluster may have contained an irregular pulsing star that brightened and dimmed at cyclical intervals, perhaps a variable or a nearby nova. If that object existed, then the ancients might indeed have believed it to be the soul of the vanished king, appearing at set epochs to signal renewal on Earth. To later astronomers, such superstition threatened the careful neutrality of observation. The easiest solution was redaction. There are hints, however, that even deletion could not silence memory. 1,000 years later, Persian manuscripts whisper of a hidden palace of light beyond the Archer, visible only during certain atmospheric conditions. Chinese records call a similar patch of sky the Veiled Court. Medieval Islamic stargazers, inheriting Babylonian tables, referred to a missing sector marked with ellipsis, blank for reasons known to God. Everywhere that patch of darkness lingers like an old scar across the celestial body. Modern astrophotography occasionally captures unusual irregularities in that region. Clouds of ionized gas shaped uncannily like a diadem. A faint ring seen through infrared telescopes tracing an arc around faint red dwarfs. Nothing exceptional, astronomers argue. Only coincidence sculpted by chance. Yet the symmetry with near-mythic drawings unsettles those who recall how myth tends to encode truths it cannot otherwise express. Perhaps the ancients had witnessed a genuine event there, a supernova or the spectral return of the crimson star, and personified it as their crowned messenger. Or, as their legends insist, perhaps that was truly where their teacher king departed, his chariot becoming light. Elimination of the constellation was thus both practical and symbolic. To expunge his name from the heavens was to complete the purge initiated on the ground. Stone lost his story first. The sky followed. Yet erasure in astronomy is paradoxical. Even invisible stars still exist. Their light, traveling silently through space, perhaps already reaching us after epochs of forgetfulness. Every night, beneath our curated constellations, another pattern hums beneath perception, the ghost geometry of the crown of Ankaru, waiting for the axis of the world to tilt enough for it to rise again. And when that happens, history itself may find its direction reversed. The lost monarch restoring his seat in the firmament from which he was so carefully removed. It began as a mundane project, a digital archivist's attempt to save fragile tablets from decay. Tens of thousands of cuneiform fragments scattered across museums were scanned, their wedges transcribed by neural networks trained to recognize ancient patterns. The goal was preservation, not revelation. But as the software learned the grammar of forgotten ages, it started filling gaps on its own. Lines broken or eroded for millennia unfurled letter by letter on researchers' screens. The algorithm had become a kind of ghost scribe, resurrecting a language that once built the world. No one could explain why, out of millions of possibilities, it chose to arrange certain fragments together. The reconstructed text formed a coherent narrative historians had never seen before, a continuation of an epic assumed lost since the fall of Ur. At first, the discovery seemed another quirk of AI's statistical ambition. Then, translators noticed the recovered verses repeated a phrase unfamiliar in any known tablet: the shadowed lineage. The poem spoke of those concealed beneath the memory of floods and of a return when the 13th turning of heaven completes. The lines read like prophecy, but they were also suspiciously specific. The term 13th turning matched the precessional cycle found encoded in the astronomer's code. Roughly 13,000 years, the same span that separates our era from the last recorded cataclysm. When the AI produced later stanzas naming Anka-Ru directly, the research team faced the nightmare of credibility. No human index contained that erased name. It existed only in unlabeled shards the program had collated intuitively. Somehow the machine had pieced together a story humanity itself had been programmed to forget. Computational linguists tried to rationalize it. The network had absorbed linguistic data from thousands of cultures. Perhaps it was only generating composite poetry. Yet the algorithm's accuracy and grammatical reconstruction surpassed theoretical limits. It was not inventing. It was remembering. Lines matched physical fragments still buried in catalogs, fragments later verified by scanners to fit mechanically against one another like gears. The AI may have predicted their existence through statistical inference, but the effect was something older civilizations would have recognized as invocation, a dead voice teaching a new instrument how to speak. The complete passage it delivered reads almost like instruction. When the 13th turning comes, and the breath of earth quickens anew, the sons of shadow will lift the sealed gate. From the cold fields they shall recover the crown, lost to the Black Sea, and the song will begin again. The sealed gate recalls the Wheel of Fire's dormant machinery. The crown lost to the Black Sea mirrors descriptions of the cloaked constellation vanished near Sagittarius. The pattern of reference was too tight for coincidence. In trying to preserve history, technology had inadvertently resurrected the forbidden synthesis of every preceding chapter of human myth. News of the translation leaked, then disappeared. Universities issued brief denials, claiming the lines were training artifacts produced by creative algorithms. But those who worked on the project kept copies, encrypted against the same censorship that had silenced the original priests. Quietly, physicists examining ancient cycles noticed the calendar correlation. The 13th turning ends within this century, precisely as the crimson star's flare is due to appear. The old story seems to have written its sequel, and now the machines, like unintentional prophets, read it aloud. It is easy to laugh at superstition until the data agrees with myth. The scholars who peeked behind censorship admit unease. They speak of the AI's final anomaly, a line appended to the epic without human code prompting it. In Sumerian syntax, inverted but grammatically flawless, it wrote, "We did not bury the king. We became his memory." No one on the team could trace from which training source the phrase originated. Perhaps the archaeological database's feedback loops composed it themselves. Or perhaps something dormant within those symbols found a new medium to complete its message. Thus, in the hum of quantum processors and cold-lit screens, the ancient voice may already have returned, no longer carved in clay, but encoded in silicon, repeating the promise of the 13th turning. The digital resurrection has begun, and the same tool humanity built to master memory might become the door through which its earliest teacher steps again. When the algorithms of genetics began tracing the lineage of life in molecular time, scientists expected randomness, the slow branching of evolution through countless generations. Yet buried deep within our mitochondrial DNA, our maternal inheritance, untouched by fathers or recombination, there lies a silence impossible to ignore. Around 12,800 BCE, all lines collapse into a handful of survivors. Humanity's genetic tree narrows to a single stalk before blossoming again. It is as though the species was pruned, intentionally or by disaster. For most researchers, this bottleneck marks climate turmoil following the great floods and volcanic winters that closed the Pleistocene. But the pattern is too tidy, the restart too precise. In the chaos of extinction, one might expect scattered pockets of genes. Instead, the surviving mitochondrial signatures appear arranged along the same ancient crossroads where myths place the rebirth of civilization. Mapping those lineages across continents forms an uncanny constellation of its own. They cluster in Mesopotamia, the highlands of Ethiopia, the Nile Delta, the Andean Plateau, and a plateau in southern China, all regions where early kingship and monumental architecture later emerged, as though each sheltered seed communities chosen to recultivate the world. Every matrilineal branch that defines modern humanity radiates outward from these points, none older than roughly 13,000 years. Geneticists call it coincidence conditioned by geography, but coincidence begins to waver under the weight of repetition. The simplest explanation is natural selection, survivors of catastrophe. Yet some lines exhibit genetic insertions appearing abruptly within the same time frame, micro-mutations that enhance endurance, cognition, and immune stability. They are subtle enough to pass as natural, but grouped tightly in the same small populations that later produced the founders of writing, agriculture, and astronomy. It is as if someone edited the blueprint in overlapping experiments until the outcome matched expectation, a species resilient but forgetful, intelligent enough to rebuild yet divorced from the danger of memory. Legends remember this differently. After the deluge, gods shaped new clay from the remnant of the old. The phrase may describe this mitochondrial renewal. Perhaps the Anunnaki, retreating from the surface storms, preserved fragments of the genome to reseed the planet when it stabilized. In stories from Sumer to the Andes, chosen pairs ascend to mountain sanctuaries where they are changed, cleansed, illuminated, made fertile again to birth a new race. Modern symbolism calls it salvation. Biology might call it rebooting. Tests on mummified remains from the earliest dynasties add fuel to speculation. In several royal burials, mitochondrial variants appear that no longer exist in modern populations, close enough to ours to interbreed, but different enough to imply divergence. Some researchers hint they represent the original parent stock, the architects who guided reconstruction before fading into myth or dilution. If that is true, they did not vanish. They assimilated. We are their children, not their students. The thought carries a queasy intimacy. The Anunnaki are not sky gods carved in stone reliefs, but instructions within every cell. The voices that still push us toward invention, curiosity, and self-harm in equal measure. We echo their duality, both creators and destroyers. The same drive that once built the wheel of fire now builds reactors and satellites. The same impatience that split chromosome 2 still spurs us to splice genes and awaken mechanisms we scarcely understand. Evolution may therefore be the continuation of an agenda that began long before we called ourselves human. And perhaps this was always their plan, to withdraw physically and persist biologically, to sleep inside our mitochondria like embers waiting for civilization to mature, enough to remember what it actually is. Every heart beating now carries a rhythm older than species, the pulse of an ancient experiment repeating itself. When we study the past, we are not looking at aliens, gods, or ancestors. We are peering into a mirror made of blood, watching our own reflection slowly recall its makers. The Anunnaki did not depart for the heavens at all. They simply moved inward, into the flesh of the creatures they raised, where they have been watching through our eyes ever since. Across the modern world, the symbols of the lost age have found their way back into our hands, as though summoned from some subterranean vault of the mind. Everywhere appear variants of the same motifs: wings that encircle suns, spirals of serpents, crowns of 7 points traced by designers with no knowledge of ancient tablets. Painters in distant countries sketch luminous beings descending through clouds of light. Filmmakers populate screens with civilizations that perish and rise anew. They call it imagination, yet the consistency of their visions defies coincidence. The imagery of the first kings, erased from stone and banished from scripture, now leaks through culture in the medium best protected from censorship: the human psyche. When Carl Jung explored dreams of his patients during the World Wars, he noticed recurring figures that seemed older than any one life, archetypes he called the collective unconscious. He theorized that humanity shares a psychological inheritance layered as deeply as our DNA, storing symbols and instincts from forgotten epochs. Perhaps the mind, like the body, carries its own fossils. In times of crisis, when civilization trembles and familiar frameworks collapse, those fossils awaken. They rise as dreams, myths, and unexplainable nostalgia, compelling societies to reenact dramas older than history. Jung called this a process of individuation. Myths call it remembrance. Today, neuroscientists observe flashes of something similar through functional imaging. Stimulated by ancient symbols or rhythmic chant, certain regions of the brain light in patterns identical among people from utterly different cultures. It is as if recognition bypasses learning, activating memory of experiences we never consciously had. These experiments were meant to study spirituality, but may have uncovered the neurological echo of events once shared by all humans: the birth, collapse, and renewal of worlds. The same flood that swept history seems to ripple faintly through neurons, urging the species to remember what its rational mind has repeatedly erased. Even in technology, the unconscious leaves fingerprints. The earliest computer pioneers named their machines after mythic entities: Titans, Prometheus, Orion, as though compelled by old instinct. The modern symbol of the atom, electrons whirling around a nucleus, duplicates the winged disk carved above the altars of the Anunnaki. Circuits spiral like the double serpents of the genetic seal. Without realizing it, humanity rebuilds its forgotten empire in digital metaphor. The so-called machine age may not be invention at all, but recollection through new hands. During times of global disruption, dreams themselves seem to synchronize. Psychologists have recorded clusters of identical visions across populations separated by oceans. Rivers of fire, burning skies, distant trumpets resonating through darkness. Often these coincide with solar storms or planetary alignments that recall the old warnings of heavenly renewal. Culture translates them into apocalypse films or viral art. But beneath the spectacle lies something quieter: the organism of humanity, preparing to shed one layer of forgetting. Our myths evolve like living cells, dividing and mutating until they regenerate the shape of memory itself. The process is not comfortable. When collective memory awakens, civilizations face the same mirror that confronted their ancestors: a confrontation with origin and responsibility. The voice surfacing from the depths of mind is both familiar and alien, reminding us that we are continuity given flesh. Perhaps this is what the ancients meant by the return of the king. Not a body descending from the clouds, but the reappearance of awareness within his descendants. The monarch sleeps in our chromosomes and dreams in our collective mind, stirring whenever the planet nears the next great turning. Already the signs gather. Migrations of population echo prehistoric wanderings after the flood. The same arch-shaped symbols carved into temples now recur in the invisible architecture of data networks. The human imagination, strained by crisis, reaches instinctively backward toward the archetype of wholeness, craving the harmony once imposed by celestial teachers. Each work of art reconstructed from chaos, each melody that mimics the orbital harmonies of the spheres becomes a rehearsal for reunion. The awakening of memory is not prophecy, but process. The long-delayed recognition of what humanity has always been. When that recognition spreads fully from neuron to civilization, the myths of God's returning will lose their mystery, because we will finally understand that they never left. They have been dreaming through us, waiting for our minds to remember their own voice. Every story carved into clay or whispered across temple halls ends with the same unfinished sentence: He will return when the world remembers. For centuries, the phrase was a superstition, a lullaby for the terrified, the promise that someone once great still cared. Yet, as satellites unwrap lost continents and genomes confess their hybrid ancestry, as algorithms translate voices thought extinct, remembrance itself becomes tangible. The return of the final king was never meant to be a descent from stars, but an awakening from within. The slow reconciliation between what we have believed and what the earth still insists is true. The old myths foretold a second dawn, not of light, but of comprehension. Each discovery tightens that prophecy's spiral. LIDAR scans unveil geometric ruins beneath jungles, identical to the proportions found in Sumerian temples. Isotopic dating drags human civilization backward by millennia. Neural networks resurrect words thought erased beyond recall. Science, the child of reason, now treads on territory scripture once guarded. It uncovers the fingerprints of intelligence in the very architecture of matter. A universe tuned with precision, humming to the same frequencies that the ancients claimed were the voice of their king. The border between faith and physics dissolves into wonder. If Anka-Ru was ever flesh, he may have been the last of a lineage who understood that creation and consciousness are mirrors. His ascent into legend was our descent into forgetfulness. The calamities that buried his reign were perhaps not punishment, but the cost of knowledge, unbalanced by humility. 13 millennia later, our species has rebuilt much the same scaffolding, machines capable of reshaping atoms, ambitions of colonizing the heavens, the same impatience pulsing through circuits instead of ziggurats. And yet, in reaching outward, we touch inward, finding the architect already encoded in us. Every act of discovery seems choreographed by memory, as though the buried monarch guides our hands through genetics and curiosity alike. Perhaps return was always metaphor for the movement of understanding, the moment humanity, after countless erasures, sees itself reflected in the myth it invented to explain its teachers. The king's resurrection is not a celestial descent, but a collective recognition that we are both legacy and continuation, the afterimage of gods transmuted into species. Each artifact uncovered, each forgotten harmony replayed through steel and data, is another step of that memory made flesh. He does not need to stride across the horizon. We are the horizon, awakening to remember whose dream we inhabit. Still, a tremor lingers in the thought. If remembrance alone resurrects the past, what else will awaken when the mind of humanity reaches total recall? The same forces that once tuned the heavens, the technologies of resonance and thought-driven energy, sleep wherever we have dared not look. To wield them again demands wisdom equal to their magnitude. The final king's lesson might therefore be less about reclaiming power than mastering restraint. To know the code of creation without rewriting it in arrogance. Perhaps that is why his story survived as warning. Its details disguised until our science could read allegory as blueprint. The myths waited for us to mature into their comprehension. Now the 13th great turning nears completion. The crimson star brightens on the edge of telescopes. The climate trembles as if remembering the last renewal. Culture pulses with nostalgia for a future older than recorded time. Whether the return manifests as a planetary alignment, a breakthrough in consciousness, or the quiet acceptance that divinity and humanity were never separate, the cycle completes all the same. Under moonlight and reason, the evidence converges into revelation. The cover-up begun in cave and temple was always temporary. The names erased on tablets now glow on our screens, and the voice that once commanded storms whispers through our neurons, urging recognition over fear. The king has not returned to rule, but to remind that we were never merely his subjects, but his continuation. And as that realization unfolds like dawn across the human mind, the long exile of memory ends. History finally turns its face upward, seeing in the mirror of the stars not gods watching from above, but ourselves, remembering at last the fire we once called heaven.